The shepherd's hut stood tucked into the curve of a chalk hillside on the Sussex Downs, its back wall formed by the earth itself where the turf had been cut away long ago to create a level shelf. The front wall and the two short side walls were made of flint nodules gathered from the surrounding fields, stacked with care and mortared with a mixture of clay and chopped straw that had hardened to the colour and consistency of old biscuit. The roof was a thick layer of wheat straw laid in bundles and held down against the wind by a net of twisted hemp ropes, weighted at the ends with large stones that hung just above the ground like pendulums on a clock that never ticked. Inside the hut, there was a single room with a floor of rammed chalk that had been worn smooth by the passage of bare feet and the scraping of a rough wooden stool. The air in that small space carried a dry scent of sun-baked grass stems from the thatch above, combined with the heavier, warmer smell of sheep wool that had seeped into every porous surface over the course of many seasons. A narrow opening in the flint wall faced east toward the land rather than south toward the sea, because the prevailing wind came from the southwest and would drive rain directly into any opening that looked out upon the water. The shepherd had learned this when he was a boy helping his own father build the first version of this shelter on this same spot, and the memory of a wet bed of bracken was enough to fix the orientation of a door for a lifetime. Early September on the Downs arrived with a particular quality of light that seemed thinner than the heavy gold of August, but not yet possessing the sharp, slanting clarity of October. The shepherd woke inside his hut well before the sun climbed over the rim of the eastern ridge. He did not wake because of any sound or alarm, but simply because the habit of waking in the dark was so deeply ingrained that his eyes opened at the same moment they had opened the morning before, and the morning before that, a rhythm set by the needs of a flock that did not understand the concept of sleeping past the first grey suggestion of dawn. He lay still for a short while on his bed of dried bracken covered by a woolen blanket, listening to the absence of sound that was itself a kind of presence on the high downs where there were no trees to rustle and no streams to gurgle. The only thing he heard was the faint regular whisper of his own breathing, and very far away beyond the thick flint wall, the thin call of a single meadow pipit, beginning its ascent song somewhere out over the rough grass. Rising from the bed was a slow process of unfolding stiff joints and reaching for the heavy cloak that hung from a wooden peg driven into a crack between the flints. The cloak was made of wool from his own flock, carded and spun by a woman in the village at the foot of the Downs during the long winter evenings, and woven on a loom that creaked in a way he could recall if he tried, but did not often think about. It was undyed, the natural colour of the sheep ranging from a deep charcoal grey across the shoulders to a paler oatmeal shade where the sun had bleached the outer fibres. He swung the garment around his shoulders and secured it at the left side with a simple bronze pin shaped like a curled serpent. The metal warm from being inside the hut all night rather than cold like the iron tools leaning in the corner. His feet went into sandals of thick cowhide with the hair left on the underside to provide grip on the dewy grass, the leather straps winding twice around his ankles and tied in a knot that he could undo in the dark without thinking. Stepping out of the low doorway required him to duck his head and turn slightly sideways, a motion that had become as automatic as the waking. The world outside the hut was a wash of soft grey tones, the sky and the land not yet separated by a horizon line, but blending together in a single dim expanse. The grass underfoot was cold and heavy with dew that soaked into the rawhide of his sandals immediately, and sent a brief chill through the soles of his feet before the warmth of movement overcame it. He stood for a moment just outside the door, orienting himself not by sight, but by the feel of the air on his left cheek, which told him the wind was still coming from the southwest, as it nearly always did in the early part of the autumn. Satisfied that nothing in the fundamental arrangement of the world had shifted overnight, he began to walk up the gentle slope toward the crest of the ridge where the flock would be found. The walk took him along a path that was not marked by any sign or cairn, but existed only as a slightly paler line in the turf where countless footsteps over countless days had bruised the grass just enough to alter its color by a shade or two. A dry stream bed cut across the hillside at an angle, a shallow channel carved by winter rains that had not flowed with water since the previous spring. The bottom of the channel was lined with rounded flint pebbles that clicked softly under his sandals as he crossed, the sound swallowed immediately by the wide, open air of the down. On the far side of the dry bed, the ground rose more steeply for a dozen paces before leveling out onto the broad, rolling back of the ridge, where the grass grew short and dense, and the chalk beneath lay close to the surface like bone beneath taut skin. The flock was scattered across the slope in small groups of 3 or 4 ewes with their nearly grown lambs, the animals barely visible as pale shapes against the grey grass. They were not asleep, but lying down with their legs folded neatly beneath them, chewing with the slow, grinding motion of their jaws that had continued through the night and would continue through most of the day. The shepherd did not rush toward them nor call out. He simply stopped at the edge of the flock's spread and stood with his weight resting on his crook, a length of blackthorn root that had been cut from a hedgerow in the Weald when he was a young man and had been polished by the grip of his hand until the wood shone with a deep, dark lustre in any light. The crook was not just a tool for catching sheep by the leg, but also a staff for walking, and a prop for standing, and a companion in the long hours of stillness. The first part of the morning routine was the slow circuit of the flock's grazing ground. He walked not in a straight line, but in a looping, meandering path that took him close enough to each group of sheep to see their faces clearly in the growing light. He was not counting them with numbers because he had never learned to count beyond the simple tally of notches on a stick for the purpose of trading fleeces. Instead, he knew each ewe by the particular pattern of dark spots on her white face, or the angle at which one ear drooped lower than the other, or the way a certain lamb always stood slightly apart from its mother, with its head turned toward the sea. There was a ewe with a patch of rusty brown wool on her left shoulder where the fleece had been stained by iron-rich soil during a rainstorm 2 winters ago, and the stain had never washed out. There was another ewe, walked with a slight limp from an old hoof injury that had healed crookedly, and caused her to bob her head in a distinctive rhythm with each step. He saw all of these animals and noted their presence and their condition and their location without speaking a single word aloud. During this walk he paused several times to examine the feet of sheep that were standing rather than lying down. Foot rot was a constant concern on the damp chalkland where the soil held moisture close to the surface, even when the grass tops seemed dry. He would approach a ewe slowly, making a low sound in his throat that was not quite a word, but served to announce his presence without startling the animal. Then he would bend down and lift a hind leg to inspect the cleft of the hoof. The texture of the hoof wall was hard and black and smooth in a healthy animal, but could become soft and ragged and foul-smelling when the rot set in. On this morning, all the hooves he checked were sound, the horn cool and dry to the touch, and he released each leg with a gentle pat on the animal's flank before moving on. The light strengthened gradually as he completed his circuit, the grey tones of the pre-dawn world giving way first to a faint wash of pink along the eastern horizon, and then to a clearer, paler yellow that seemed to rise out of the land itself. The dew on the grass began to catch this new light and transform from a dull wetness into a scattering of tiny bright points that covered the entire hillside like a field of very small and very temporary stars. The shepherd paused at the highest point of the ridge, a spot where the chalk was so close to the surface that the grass grew thin and wiry, and the ground felt hard as stone beneath the thin soil. From this vantage point he could see both the inland side of the downs where the land rolled away in a series of smooth green waves toward the distant smudge of the Wealden forest, and the seaward side where the chalk cliffs dropped away steeply to a narrow strip of shingle beach and the grey-green water of the channel beyond. He turned to face the sea as he did every morning, not because he expected to see anything different, but because the act of looking was part of the pattern of his day. The water stretched out flat and calm under the lightening sky, its surface broken only by the faint lines of tidal currents that moved below the surface and expressed themselves as subtle variations in the texture of the grey. The tide was halfway out, exposing a band of dark, wet shingle along the base of the cliffs, and the sound of the small waves collapsing onto that shingle reached his ears as a continuous, distant hiss that was more a presence in the air than a distinct noise. Above the water, there hung a long, low bank of haze that sat right on the horizon line, a band of greyish-white that was slightly darker than the sky above it and slightly lighter than the sea below it. The haze was a familiar feature of the autumn months, when the cooling land met the still, warm water and created a veil of moisture that could linger for days or weeks. Sometimes the haze was thin enough that the shepherd could see the faint outline of the French coast on the far side of the channel, a low line of cliffs that mirrored his own but paler and more distant. On this morning, the haze was thicker than usual, a dense bank that obscured everything beyond a few miles from the shore and made the sea appear to end in a soft, indefinite blur rather than a hard line. He looked at the haze for a long moment without focusing on anything in particular, his eyes relaxed and his mind empty of thoughts beyond the simple observation of the color and the texture of the air. Then he turned away from the sea and began the walk back down the slope toward the hut. The sun had now cleared the ridge and was shining fully on the hillside, warming the grass and releasing the scent of wild thyme and crushed chamomile that grew in low mats among the turf. The warmth felt good on the back of his neck where the cloak had slipped down to expose the skin above his tunic. He walked slowly with the crook tapping the ground in a steady rhythm that matched his pace, a sound so familiar to the sheep that they did not even lift their heads as he passed among them. Back at the hut, he took a piece of hard, flat bread from a linen cloth stored in a niche in the flint wall. The bread was made from barley flour, mixed with a little water and baked on a hot stone, the resulting cake dense and dry and capable of lasting for many days without spoiling. He broke off a corner and chewed it slowly while sitting on the wooden stool just outside the door, his back against the sun-warmed flint of the wall, and his eyes half closed against the brightness. A small brown bird hopped onto a tuft of grass a few feet away and regarded him with a bright black eye before flying off toward the dry stream bed with a sharp chipping call. The morning was now fully established, and the shape of the day stretched out before him as a long, unbroken expanse of time that would be filled with small tasks and long pauses, and the simple, continuous act of watching. The shepherd rose from the stool after a while and walked to the edge of the flat shelf where the hut stood, looking down into the shallow valley that curved away to the east. This valley was his particular charge, the grazing ground that had been allotted to his care by the manor steward many years ago, and that he had never left for more than a day's walk in any direction. He knew every fold in the ground and every patch of different grass, and every stone that was large enough to sit upon. There was a place where the chalk outcropped in a low white scar that caught the afternoon sun and held the warmth long into the evening. There was a place where a spring seeped out of the hillside in the winter months, creating a small patch of bright green watercress that the sheep would eat with particular enthusiasm. There was a place where the wind always seemed to be stronger, no matter which direction it blew from, a small funnel in the topography that accelerated the air into a constant low moan. All of these places were as familiar to him as the lines on his own palms, and he moved among them without conscious thought, his feet finding the easiest path, and his body leaning into the slope at just the right angle. The rest of the morning passed in this way, a slow drift of small observations and minor adjustments to the position of his body in relation to the sun and the wind. He walked to the western edge of the valley and stood looking out over the channel again, where the haze had not moved or changed in any detectable way. He walked to the eastern edge and looked inland toward the distant dark line of the forest. He sat on the warm flint stone embedded in the turf near the center of the valley and listened to the sound of the sheep grazing, a steady rhythmic tearing of grass blades that filled the air like the sound of a very quiet and very patient machine. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows of the sheep shrank into dark pools directly beneath their bodies. The day moved forward with the slow, imperceptible momentum of a cloud crossing a wide sky, and the shepherd moved with it, a part of the landscape as fixed and as patient as the chalk beneath his feet. The afternoon of that same day settled over the Sussex Downs with a weight that was not oppressive but simply present, a thickness in the air that came from the full warmth of the September sun after the chill of the morning had burned away completely. The shepherd had finished his midday meal of more barley bread with a small piece of hard cheese wrapped in a dock leaf, and had drunk water from a leather bottle that hung in the shade on the north side of the hut, where the flint wall never received direct sun. Now he stood at the edge of the valley with his crook in his hand, and his eyes moving slowly over the scattered shapes of the flock that had spread out across the lower slope, to graze on the longer grass that grew where the chalk was deeper and the soil held more moisture. The light at this hour was high and flat and unflattering, washing out the colors of the land into a uniform pale greenish gray that made the white shapes of the sheep stand out with particular clarity against the turf. The task that occupied the shepherd for the first long stretch of the afternoon was not a task in the sense of labor that produced a visible result, but rather a practice of attention that had become as natural as breathing over the course of his years on the down. He was counting the flock without numbers, building a mental picture of the whole by assembling the individual pieces one by one until the entire collection of animals existed in his mind as a complete and satisfactory image. The process began with the ewes he knew best, the ones whose faces he could summon to memory even when his eyes were closed and the hut was dark. There was the old ewe with the left horn that curled in a tighter spiral than the right horn, a detail so subtle that anyone else looking at the animal would likely not notice it, but which to the shepherd was as distinctive as a name written on parchment. She was standing near the dry stream bed, with her head down and her jaws working in that slow, sideways motion that characterized a sheep at rest, and her presence in that particular spot was noted and filed away in the shepherd's awareness. Near her stood a younger ewe with a patch of dark wool on the bridge of her nose that formed a shape vaguely like an acorn cup. This ewe had been born 3 springs ago on a night of heavy rain, when the shepherd had brought the labouring mother into the hut to keep the lamb dry during its first hours, and the memory of that small wet creature trembling on the pack's chalk floor was attached permanently to the sight of the dark patch on her grown face. She raised her head as the shepherd's gaze passed over her, and looked in his direction for a moment with the blank, calm expression that sheep wear when they are neither alarmed nor curious, but simply aware of a familiar presence. Then she lowered her head again and resumed tearing at the grass with a sound like the ripping of coarse cloth. Further down the slope, a group of 4 lambs that were nearly the size of their mothers but still retained the slightly gangly proportions of youth were bunched together in a loose cluster near a patch of wild thyme. Their fleeces were cleaner and brighter than those of the older animals because they had not yet accumulated the years of staining from soil and weather and the rubbing against chalk outcrops. The shepherd watched them for a while and noted that the smallest of the 4 was the one with a white face completely unmarked by any spot or fleck, a rarity among the flock that made her instantly recognizable even from a great distance. She was also the one who tended to wander farther from the group than the others, and required an extra moment of attention during the counting process to confirm that she had not strayed beyond the natural boundaries of the valley. The crook rested in the shepherd's hand with the familiarity of an extension of his own arm. The wood was blackthorn, cut from a hedgerow in the Weald many years ago when he was still young enough to make the long walk down from the downs and back in a single day without feeling the ache in his knees that now accompanied any journey longer than the circuit of the flock's grazing ground. The root end of the crook formed a natural curve that had required only a small amount of shaping with a knife to become the perfect hook for catching a sheep by the hind leg just above the hoof. The shaft was straight and smooth and slightly thicker at the bottom where his hand gripped it most often, the wood polished to a deep brown luster by the constant friction of his palm and the oils from his skin. There was a small knot in the wood about 1/3 of the way up from the bottom, that his thumb found automatically whenever he held the crook, a tiny imperfection that served as a reference point for his grip, in the same way that the distinctive marks on the sheep's faces served as reference points for his counting. The shepherd began to walk slowly along the contour of the hillside, a path that kept him on level ground without climbing or descending, and allowed him to pass within a few dozen paces of each group of sheep in turn. As he walked, he paid attention to the condition of the wool on the animals he passed. Wool was the reason for the flock's existence in the eyes of the manor steward, who collected the annual fleeces and sent them to the market in loos, and the quality of the wool was the measure by which the shepherd's work was judged when the shearing time came in the early summer. But the shepherd himself thought of the wool not as a commodity to be weighed and sold, but as a living part of the animal that changed with the seasons and the weather and the health of the ewe who grew it. The fleece of a healthy sheep in September was at its fullest and most dense, the growth of the summer having reached its peak before the natural slowing that would come with the shorter days of autumn. Running his hand over the back of a ewe who stood still for his inspection, the shepherd felt the deep springy resilience of the wool under his palm and the slight greasy tackiness of the lanolin that coated each individual fibre. Lanolin was the substance that kept the sheep dry in the rain and protected the skin from the constant dampness of the chalkland turf. It had a smell that was not unpleasant but distinctive, a warm animal odour that clung to the shepherd's own hands and clothing, and had become so familiar to him that he no longer noticed it except when he was away from the flock for more than a day, and then returned to find the scent welcoming him back like an old friend. The outer layer of the fleece was coarser to the touch than the inner layer, the fibers longer and slightly curled at the tips where they had been exposed to the sun and the wind. This outer wool was the color of unbleached linen on most of the sheep, a pale creamy grey that caught the light and held it in a soft glow. On some of the animals the outer wool was darker, tending toward a deep charcoal that was the natural color of the breed, and that produced a yarn much prized for making cloaks that did not show the dirt of daily wear. The shepherd noted which ewes carried this darker wool, and which carried the lighter, not because the information was urgently needed, but because noting things was what he did during the long hours of watching. Beneath the outer layer, the wool became finer and softer and warmer to the touch. This was the underfleece that would be carded and spun into the softest yarn for making garments worn next to the skin. The shepherd could feel the transition from coarse to fine by pressing his fingers deeper into the fleece until his fingertips touched the warmth of the animal's body beneath. The heat that rose from the sheep's skin was surprising on a mild September afternoon, a reminder of the constant furnace that burned inside each animal and turned grass into wool and breath into the small white puffs of vapor that appeared on cold mornings. He withdrew his hand, and the ewe shook herself slightly, a ripple of movement that passed from her shoulders to her tail and settled the fleece back into its natural arrangement. He continued his walk along the contour of the hill and came to the flat embedded flintstone that had been his sitting place for as long as he had tended this flock. The stone was a single large nodule of dark grey flint, with the surface worn smooth by weather and by the countless hours he had spent resting upon it. The flint was embedded in the chalk so firmly that it did not shift even when he lowered his full weight onto it, and the angle at which it sat was such that his back could rest against the rising slope behind, while his feet stretched out onto the grass before him. From this position he could see the entire valley spread out below, and the sea beyond the cliffs and the hazy band of moisture that still hung on the horizon without moving or changing shape. He sat on the flintstone and felt the warmth of the sun stored in the dark surface seeping through his woolen tunic and into the muscles of his lower back. The warmth was pleasant and slow, and induced a state of relaxed attention in which his eyes could move over the flock without urgency, while his mind drifted through the same familiar channels it had travelled 1,000 times before. He thought about the texture of wool, and the way a single fleece contained fibers of many different lengths and thicknesses depending on which part of the sheep's body they came from. The wool on the shoulders was different from the wool on the flanks, which was different again from the wool on the belly. The shepherd knew these differences, in the same way he knew the faces of his ewes, through long and patient observation that had never been put into words, but existed as a body of knowledge stored in his hands and his eyes. The sound of the grass being torn by small teeth continued without pause, a constant low background noise that was made up of hundreds of individual ripping sounds, all happening at slightly different moments. Occasionally a ewe would lift her head and chew for a while with a slow grinding motion that produced a softer, wetter sound. Then she would lower her head again, and the tearing would resume. The sheep moved across the pasture in a loose drift that was guided by the availability of the sweetest grass and the direction of the wind and the subtle preferences of each individual animal. They did not move as a tight flock like they would if a dog were herding them, but rather as a dispersed cloud of white shapes that shifted and flowed and reformed over the course of the afternoon in patterns that the shepherd had learned to read like a language. The lambs that were nearly grown still followed their mothers more closely than the older ewes followed each other. The shepherd watched a particular pair, a ewe with a distinctive notch in her right ear and her lamb that was now almost as large as she was, moving together across a patch of clover. The lamb would take a few steps away to investigate a different tuft of grass, and then return to the mother's side as if checking that she was still there, a behavior that would fade completely by the time the next spring arrived and the lamb became a ewe with lambs of her own. The shepherd had watched this cycle repeat itself more times than he could count, and it never became less familiar, but also never became less satisfying to observe, like watching the same simple pattern appear again and again in the weave of a cloth. The afternoon light began to shift almost imperceptibly toward the longer shadows of evening. The sun was still high enough that the warmth remained on the grass, but the angle had changed enough that the shepherd's shadow on the ground beside the flintstone had stretched from a squat, dark shape directly beneath him into a longer silhouette that reached partway down the slope. He noticed this change in the same way he noticed the slight shift in the wind that now came more from the west than the southwest, a difference that he felt as a subtle cooling on his left cheek where the air had been warm before. These small changes accumulated throughout the day and told him the time more accurately than any sundial or marked candle could have done. He rose from the flintstone after a long while and walked a different path back through the flock, this time following the curve of the valley bottom, where the grass was longest and the soil was softest underfoot. His sandals left shallow impressions in the turf that would spring back within an hour and be invisible by morning. The sheep that he passed on this lower path paid him no more attention than they had on the upper path, their heads remaining down and their jaws continuing their steady work. A single ewe, with a dark brown face and pale grey wool, looked up as he approached and took one step to the side to give him room to pass, then immediately returned to her grazing, as if he were no more significant than a cloud passing briefly across the sun. The shepherd completed his circuit of the flock and returned to the flat shelf where his hut stood. The afternoon had now passed into the early part of the evening, and the quality of the light had softened from the harsh flatness of midday into a gentler gold that made the chalk of the distant cliffs glow with a pale warmth. He stood for a while looking out over the sea again, where the haze had neither thickened nor thinned, but simply remained, a patient presence on the horizon that asked nothing and revealed nothing. Then he turned back toward the land and watched the long shadows of the sheep stretching across the grass like dark blue pools of water flowing slowly downhill as the sun continued its descent. The counting of the flock was complete. Every ewe and every lamb was accounted for in the shepherd's mind, their positions noted and their conditions assessed, and their familiar faces filed away in the memory that would serve him again tomorrow when the same task began anew with the same animals in slightly different places on the same hillside. The wool on their backs would continue to grow slowly through the shortening days of autumn, adding length to the fibers and weight to the fleeces that would be shorn when the spring returned. The shepherd thought about this as he stood in the fading light, not with any sense of anticipation or planning, but simply as an acknowledgement of the cycle that turned beneath all the small daily cycles of walking and watching and counting. The sound of the grass being torn continued behind him as he turned toward the hut, and the evening that waited with its own small rituals of bread and water, and the slow settling of the flock into the hollow where they would spend the night. The weather changed during the night, not with a storm or a sudden shift of wind, but with a gradual thickening of the air that began while the shepherd slept, and was complete by the time he woke. The first sign of the change came when he opened his eyes in the darkness of the hut and noticed that the quality of the silence was different. On a normal morning, the silence of the downs was a thin and transparent thing, through which small distant sounds could travel great distances. The bleat of a ewe on the far side of the valley, the cry of a gull circling over the cliffs, the faint whisper of the tide on the shingle beach far below. This morning the silence was dense and heavy and complete, a muffled blanket that pressed against the ears and admitted no sound from beyond the flint walls of the hut. The shepherd lay still on his bed of bracken and listened to the new quality of the quiet, recognizing it immediately as the presence of Seafret even before he rose and pushed aside the leather flap that covered the doorway. Seafret was a common visitor to the Sussex Downs in the early autumn, when the water of the channel remained warm from the summer, while the land cooled rapidly under the longer nights. The warm water breathed moisture into the air, and the cool land pulled that moisture toward itself, creating a dense fog that rolled up the chalk cliffs and spread across the high ground like a slow tide of grey wool. The shepherd had known the fret many times before, and he did not fear it or find it remarkable. It was simply a condition of the world that arrived from time to time and then departed, leaving the grass wetter than before, and the sheep's fleeces beaded with droplets that caught the returning sun. He ducked through the low doorway and straightened up outside the hut into a world that had been erased. The valley that he knew as intimately as his own hands was gone, replaced by a soft grey emptiness that began at the end of his outstretched arm and extended in all directions without feature or landmark. The hut behind him was a dim shape already fading into the murk, and the grass beneath his feet was visible only as a dark suggestion of texture rather than a clear surface. He stood very still for a long moment and allowed his other senses to orient him in the absence of sight. The ground sloped away beneath his sandals at the familiar angle that told him he was facing down into the valley. The air on his skin was cool and damp, and completely still, without the faintest breath of wind to stir the fog. The smell of the frat was distinctive, a combination of salt and wet chalk, and something else that was simply the scent of the sea itself carried inland on the tiny droplets of water that filled the air. The shepherd began to walk slowly toward the place where the flock had settled for the night, a natural hollow in the hillside that was protected from the worst of the wind and had become the animal's preferred sleeping ground over many generations. He could not see the hollow or the sheep within it, but he knew the number of steps required to reach the spot, and he counted them silently as he walked, his feet finding the familiar contours of the ground even when his eyes could not confirm them. The fog was so thick that his own body seemed to push a tunnel through it as he moved, the grey whiteness parting before his face and closing again behind his back, so that he existed in a small moving bubble of slightly clearer air. The moisture in the fog collected on his eyebrows and on the short hairs of his beard, forming tiny droplets that grew slowly heavier until they merged and ran down his face in cold trails that he wiped away with the back of his hand. The sound of his footsteps was strange in the freed. On a clear day, the soft thud of his sandals on the turf was a sound that travelled outward and faded gradually into the distance. In the fog, the sound seemed to stop at the edge of his small bubble of visibility, absorbed by the dense wet air so completely that he heard nothing but the immediate squelch of leather on grass, and then a profound silence that closed in behind each step, like water filling a footprint. The sheep were silent too, which was unusual. Normally the flock would stir as he approached with small bleats of recognition and the rustle of bodies rising from the ground. In the fog, the animals remained quiet and still, their shapes emerging from the grey only when he was close enough to touch them. The first ewe he encountered was the old one with the mismatched horns. She appeared as a pale ghost in the murk, her fleece blending with the fog so perfectly that only the dark points of her face and legs gave away her presence. She was lying down with her legs folded beneath her and her head raised slightly, her ears pricked forward as if listening for something that she could not quite hear. The shepherd bent down and placed his hand on her back where the wool was damp on the surface, but warm and dry an inch beneath. The ewe did not startle at his touch, because she had smelled him coming long before his hand reached her, the scent of his wool cloak and his skin cutting through the fog in a way that sight and sound could not. He moved on from ewe to ewe, touching each one briefly to confirm her presence and her health, and the flock allowed this without rising or moving away. The fog remained thick throughout the first morning, and showed no sign of lifting when the sun should have been climbing toward its midday height. The shepherd could not see the sun at all, only a diffuse brightening of the grey that told him the day was progressing somewhere above the blanket of fret. He returned to the hut and sat on the wooden stool just inside the doorway, where he could look out into the featureless grey, while remaining sheltered from the moisture that dripped steadily from the thatch above. The sound of the dripping was the only sound in the world, a soft, regular plink of water falling from the ends of the straw bundles onto the packed chalk of the threshold. Each drop fell at a slightly different interval from the one before, because the water accumulated on the straw at different rates, depending on the exact angle of each stalk and the amount of fog that had condensed upon it. The shepherd listened to this rhythm without counting it or analyzing it, letting the sound wash over him as a kind of company in the otherwise silent day. His cloak had grown heavy with the moisture it had absorbed during his morning walk. Wool could hold a great deal of water without feeling wet to the touch, because the lanolin in the fibers repelled the water from the individual strands while allowing it to fill the spaces between them. The result was a garment that was much heavier than it had been in the dry air of the previous day, but which still felt warm and comfortable against his skin. He shrugged the cloak off his shoulders and hung it on the peg inside the hut where it would dry slowly in the still air, releasing the scent of wet wool and lanolin and the faint salt tang of the sea into the small enclosed space. The afternoon of the first day of fog passed in a similar manner to the morning, with the shepherd making slow circuits of the flock's immediate vicinity, and then returning to the hut to wait. The waiting was not an active state of expectation, but rather a passive acceptance of the fog's presence, an acknowledgement that nothing could be done until the weather changed of its own accord. He ate a piece of the hard barley bread and drank water from the leather bottle, and watched the grey wall beyond the doorway with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life watching things that changed very slowly or not at all. The light in the fog began to fade earlier than it would have on a clear day, the diffuse brightness dimming into a deeper grey that was almost charcoal, and then into a blackness so complete that the shepherd could not see his own hand when he held it before his face. In the darkness of the hut, he performed the small ritual of lighting the rushlight. The rushlight was a simple thing, made from the pith of a common rush plant that had been peeled and dried and then soaked in melted mutton fat. The resulting taper was about the length of his forearm and would burn for perhaps an hour if he kept it trimmed and did not let the flame grow too high. Lighting it required a piece of dried tinder fungus that he kept in a small leather pouch along with a flint striker and a curved piece of iron. He knelt on the chalk floor and arranged the tinder fungus on a flat stone, then struck the flint against the iron with a quick downward motion that sent a shower of small orange sparks onto the dark surface of the fungus. The sparks glowed briefly and died, and he struck again and again until one spark caught in the fibrous material and began to grow into a small red ember that pulsed with each gentle breath he blew across it. He held the end of the rushlight to the ember and watched the pith catch fire, the flame small and yellow and steady, producing a circle of warm light that pushed back the darkness of the hut by a few feet. The rushlight cast shadows on the flint walls that moved very slowly as the flame flickered in the almost imperceptible currents of air that found their way through the gaps in the thatch. The shepherd sat with his back against the wall and watched the shadows, his eyes following the dance of light and dark without any conscious thought. The fog outside continued to press against the hut, silent and heavy, and the sound of dripping from the thatch had slowed to an occasional plink as the moisture supply from the air diminished during the colder night hours. The second day of fog was indistinguishable from the first in its essential qualities. The shepherd woke to the same muffled silence and stepped out into the same featureless grey. The only difference was that the ground underfoot had become noticeably softer from the constant moisture, the chalk soil absorbing the water from the air and turning from a firm pale surface into a darker and more yielding one that clung to the bottoms of his sandals in small clumps. He scraped the clumps off with a stick before entering the hut so that he would not track the wet chalk inside and turn the packed floor into a slippery mess. The action of scraping the mud from his sandals was slow and methodical, the stick working around the edges of the leather sole and then between his toes where the straps passed over his foot, and the whole process took several minutes of quiet concentration. The sheep had not moved far from their sleeping hollow during the night. They had grazed a little in the immediate vicinity, tearing at the wet grass that was now heavy with droplets of condensed fog, but they had not wandered because the fret confused their sense of direction just as it confused the shepherd's. A sheep in fog will stay close to where it last felt safe, and the hollow was such a place. The shepherd found them all clustered together more tightly than usual, their bodies pressed flank to flank in a long pale line that emerged from the grey as he approached. The warmth of their collective bodies had created a small pocket of slightly less damp air around them, and the shepherd could smell the familiar animal scent of the flock more strongly here than anywhere else on the fog-bound hillside. He stood among them for a while without moving, sharing the warmth and the smell and the quiet companionship of the animals. The colour of the channel was not visible from the hut, or from any part of the flock's grazing ground on this second day of fog. The shepherd walked to the crest of the ridge where he normally stood to look out over the water and found nothing but the same grey wall that surrounded him everywhere else. He could hear the sea more clearly from this spot, even through the muffling effect of the fret, a low, continuous roar that was not the sound of individual waves, but rather the accumulated sound of all the water in the channel moving against all the shore at once. The roar was a deeper note than the hiss of the tide on the shingle beach, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, rather than from a specific direction. He stood and listened to it for a long time, his eyes open but seeing nothing, his mind occupied with the simple fact of the sound and the moisture beading on his face and the weight of his damp cloak on his shoulders. Inside the hut that evening the shepherd lit the rushlight again and watched the flame burn down through another length of the pith. The light was just bright enough to see the rough texture of the flint wall and the darker patches where soot from many previous rushlights had stained the stone over the years. The soot marks formed patterns that the shepherd had never consciously studied, though which were as familiar to him as the faces of his sheep. There was a patch shaped vaguely like a bird with spread wings near the corner where the wall met the thatch, and another patch like a hand with splayed fingers above the niche where he kept his bread. He looked at these shapes without thinking about them, letting his eyes rest on the familiar patterns while his mind drifted through the same quiet channels it always travelled in the evening hours. The third day of fog began with a slight change in the texture of the air. The shepherd noticed it as soon as he stepped outside, a faint movement that was not quite wind, but was also not the perfect stillness of the previous 2 days. The fog was still thick and grey and all-encompassing, but it seemed to be in motion now, drifting slowly from the southwest toward the northeast, in a way that suggested the fret might be beginning to break up somewhere out over the water. He walked to the crest of the ridge again and stood facing into the drift, feeling the tiny droplets of moisture strike his face in a continuous fine spray. The sound of the sea had changed too, becoming more distinct and directional, and he could now hear the individual waves collapsing on the shingle beach far below, in addition to the deeper background roar of the open channel. The fog began to thin in the middle of the third afternoon. The process was so gradual that the shepherd could not identify the exact moment when he first became able to see farther than the length of his arm. But at some point he looked up from examining a ewe's hoof and realized that he could see the shape of the next ewe a dozen paces away. A pale blur in the grey, but definitely a shape, rather than just a suggestion. The thinning continued through the rest of the afternoon, the fog pulling back layer by layer like the peeling of an onion made of water and air. First the immediate surroundings of the hut became visible, then the slope down into the valley, then the far side of the valley with its familiar contours and the white scar of the chalk outcrop and the dark patch of gorse bushes near the eastern boundary. The sea remained hidden behind a lower bank of fog that clung to the cliffs, but the sky above began to show through as patches of pale blue that widened and merged until the whole dome of the heavens was visible again, and the sun appeared as a bright disk low in the western sky. The shepherd stood at the crest of the ridge as the last of the fret burned away and looked out over the channel. The water was a flat grey-green that seemed almost luminous after 3 days of seeing nothing but the soft white of the fog. The haze bank on the horizon had changed its shape during the days of fret, spreading out into a longer and lower line that hugged the water more closely than before. The shepherd looked at this line without any particular interest or curiosity, noting its presence in the same way he noted the presence of a cloud or a flock of gulls. He did not know that across that water, hidden by the haze in the distance, a great gathering of timber and rope and flax and sails was taking shape in the estuary of the river Dives. He did not know that the sound of hammers and the smell of pitch and the voices of many men were filling the air of a place he had never seen and would never see. He knew only that the fog had lifted and the sun was shining, and the flock was spread out across the hillside once again, grazing on the wet grass with the same steady tearing sound that had been the music of his life for as long as he could remember. He walked back down the slope toward the hut with his damp cloak heavy on his shoulders and his sandals squelching in the wet turf. The light of the late afternoon was golden and warm after the grey days of fog, and the sheep cast long shadows that stretched down the hill toward the sea. He stopped at the flat flintstone and sat for a while, letting the sun dry the moisture from his clothing and his hair, while he watched the flock and listened to the sound of the grass being torn. The fret was gone, and the world was visible again, and everything was exactly as it had been before the fog arrived, unchanged and unchangeable, patient and slow and deeply quiet. The morning after the fog lifted arrived with the sky that had been scrubbed clean by the days of fret, and now presented itself as a single unbroken expanse of pale blue from the eastern ridge to the western sea. The shepherd noticed this clarity as soon as he stepped out of the hut and looked up, not because the clarity was remarkable in itself, but because the contrast with the grey blankness of the previous days made the world seem newly made and slightly sharper at the edges. The grass underfoot was still wet from the lingering moisture that the fog had left behind, but the wetness was now a surface condition that would burn off as the sun climbed higher rather than a pervasive dampness that soaked into everything. He stood for a moment in the doorway and let his eyes travel over the familiar shapes of the valley that had been hidden for 3 days and were now fully visible again. The white scar of the chalk outcrop glowing softly in the early light, and the dark patch of gorse bushes on the eastern boundary looking almost black against the pale turf. The flock was already grazing, spread out across the lower slope in their usual loose arrangement. The shepherd made his morning circuit among them, with the crook in his hand and his eyes moving from face to face, confirming the presence of each ewe and each lamb, with the same quiet attention he gave to this task every day. The sheep were dry on their outer fleeces now, the moisture from the fog having evaporated or been shaken off during the night, and their wool had fluffed up slightly from the humidity so that they appeared larger and softer than usual. He touched the back of the old ewe with the mismatched horns as he passed her and felt the warmth of her body through the thick fleece, a reassurance that the 3 days of damp had not penetrated to her skin. When the counting was complete and he had satisfied himself that the flock was whole and healthy, the shepherd turned his attention to a task that had been waiting for his notice since before the fog arrived. On the eastern slope of the valley, where the ground fell away toward the distant line of the Wealden forest, there stood a section of wattle fence that marked the boundary between the flock's grazing ground and the rougher pasture beyond. The fence was not a barrier in the sense of a wall that could not be passed, but rather a suggestion of limits, a line of woven hazel rods that discouraged the sheep from wandering into the gorse and bramble of the unmanaged land, where they might catch their fleeces on thorns or find their way down into the steep chalk pits that dotted that part of the down. The fence had been standing for many years and had been repaired many times, each repair adding a new layer of woven wood to the older layers beneath. The particular section that needed attention was a stretch of about 10 paces, where the black-faced ram had been leaning his weight against the wattle in order to reach a patch of yarrow that grew on the far side. Yarrow was a plant with feathery leaves and flat clusters of small white flowers that the sheep found particularly appealing, and the ram had developed a habit of pressing his chest against the fence and stretching his long neck over the top rail to crop at the tender shoots. Over the course of the summer, his weight and his persistence had loosened several of the horizontal rods and pushed the tops of the vertical stakes outward, so that the whole section now leaned at a drunken angle toward the east. The shepherd had noted this damage some days before the fog arrived, and had filed it away in his memory, as a task to be addressed when the weather and the light and his own inclination aligned. This morning they aligned. The sun was warm but not hot, and the ground was soft from the fog, but not muddy, and the flock was calm, and the fence was waiting. The shepherd walked back to the hut and collected the tools he would need for the work. The tools were few and simple, and lived in a niche in the flint wall near the doorway where they would not be tripped over in the dark. There was a small hand axe with a blade of iron that had been sharpened so many times over the years that it had worn down to a narrow crescent shape, quite different from the broad curve it had possessed when it was new. The handle was ashwood, smooth and dark from the oil of his palm, and it fit into his grip with the same easy familiarity as the crook. There was a coil of thin rope made from twisted hemp fibers that he used for binding the joints of the fence where extra strength was needed. There was a leather pouch containing a few spare wooden pegs carved from dense heartwood of oak that would not rot in the chalk soil. He gathered these items and carried them in the crook of his left arm, while his right hand held the staff end of the crook for balance on the uneven ground. The walk to the eastern slope took him along the contour of the valley, a path that kept him on level ground and allowed him to pass close to the scattered groups of sheep without disturbing their grazing. The grass on this side of the valley was longer than on the seaward side, because the slope faced the morning sun rather than the afternoon sun, and the soil retained its moisture for more hours of the day. The shepherd's sandals pressed the grass flat as he walked and left a trail of darker green behind him where the blades were bent and would slowly rise again over the course of the next hour. A meadow peepit burst from a tussock near his feet and flew a short distance before dropping back into the grass, its small brown body vanishing instantly against the similar brown of the dried stems from last year's growth that still stood among the new green. The damaged section of fence came into view as he rounded the shoulder of the hill where the ground began to fall more steeply toward the east. The lean of the wattle was visible from a distance, a subtle departure from the otherwise straight line that ran across the hillside like a dark stitch on pale cloth. Up close the damage was more evident. 3 of the horizontal rods had been pushed out of their woven positions and now hung loosely between the vertical stakes, their ends no longer secured by the tension of the weave. 2 of the vertical stakes had been tilted outward by the ram's weight and now stood at an angle that reduced their effectiveness as anchors for the horizontal rods. The yarrow on the far side of the fence was cropped short and showed the pale-cut ends of stems where the ram had been feeding, evidence of his determination that the shepherd noted without any particular judgment. He set down his tools and the coil of rope on the grass beside the fence, and stood for a while looking at the damaged section with the same calm attention he gave to counting the flock. The repair would require new material, because the loosened rods could simply be pushed back into place, but they would not hold without fresh weaving to restore the tension that kept the whole structure rigid. The copse at the bottom of the slope was the source of such material, a small stand of hazel trees that had been coppiced for generations, and produced a steady supply of straight young rods each year. The shepherd left his tools by the fence and walked down the hill toward the copse, his feet finding the easiest path through the tussocks and the scattered flint stones without conscious direction. The copse was a quiet place even on a clear morning, because the trees grew closely together and their leaves caught the sound of the wind and held it among the branches. The hazel rods that the shepherd needed grew from stumps that had been cut back many times over many years, each cutting producing a cluster of new shoots that grew straight and tall and free of branches for most of their length. He walked among the stumps and selected several rods of the right thickness, testing each one by bending it gently between his hands to feel the springiness of the living wood. A good rod for wattle fencing needed to be flexible enough to weave without snapping, but stiff enough to hold its shape once woven. The hazel provided both qualities in abundance. He cut 5 rods with the small hand axe, each cut made clean and close to the stump, so that new shoots would grow from the same spot in the following spring. The cut ends showed the pale greenish white of living wood, and released a faint smell that was sharp and fresh and slightly sweet, the scent of hazel sap rising into the still morning air. He carried the rods back up the slope, with the bundle balanced on his shoulder, the ends trailing behind him and brushing against the grass with a soft swishing sound. At the fence he laid the rods on the ground in a neat row and then sat down on the turf to begin the work of preparing them. The first step was to strip the bark from each rod, because the bark would rot in place and create gaps in the weave as it shrank and fell away. He used his thumbnail to start a split in the bark at the thick end of the first rod, and then pulled the strip away in a single long piece that curled around his fingers like a brown ribbon. The wood beneath the bark was smooth and pale and slightly damp to the touch, and the smell of hazel grew stronger as each rod was stripped and added to the pile of prepared material. When the rods were bare and ready, he turned his attention to the fence itself. The first task was to straighten the tilted vertical stakes, a job that required him to dig away a little of the chalk soil from around the base of each stake with the blade of the hand axe. The soil was soft from the fog and gave way easily, crumbling into small white clods that he set aside in a neat pile. He pushed each stake back to the vertical and held it there while he tamped the soil back into place around the base with the blunt end of the axe handle. The tamping was a rhythmic action, a series of firm downward thrusts that compressed the chalk around the stake until it stood straight and solid and would not move when he tested it with his hand. The horizontal rods that had been pushed out of position were the next part of the work. He removed them entirely from the fence, sliding each one out of the weave and setting it aside on the grass. Some of these old rods were still sound and could be reused, their wood grey and weathered on the surface, but still strong at the core. Others had begun to rot where they had been in contact with the damp soil and would crumble if he tried to bend them. He sorted the old rods into 2 piles, the usable and the unusable, and then began the slow process of weaving the new and the old together into a solid section of fence. The weaving motion was one that his hands knew so well they performed it without any direction from his conscious mind. He would take a rod and slide it over the first vertical stake and under the second and over the third and under the fourth, pressing it down firmly against the rod below so that the weave was tight and the gaps were small. Each rod was bent slightly as it passed around the stakes, the tension of the bend holding the whole structure together in a kind of springy equilibrium. The sound of the weaving was a soft series of wooden taps and scrapes as the hazel rubbed against the older wood of the stakes and the other rods. The shepherd worked slowly and steadily, his hands moving in the same pattern over and over, while his eyes watched the weave grow denser and more solid with each added rod. The morning passed in this way without any interruption or distraction. The sun climbed higher, and the shadow of the fence shortened on the grass until it was just a dark line directly beneath the woven panels. The shepherd paused once to drink from the leather bottle that he had brought with him, and to eat a piece of the hard barley bread that he carried in a fold of his cloak. The water was cool, and tasted faintly of the chalk from which it had been drawn many days ago, The bread was dense and dry and required slow chewing that matched the slow pace of the work. He sat on the grass with his back against a sound section of the fence and looked out over the valley while he ate, his eyes moving over the flock without urgency, and his mind occupied with the simple satisfaction of a task being completed. The sheep had drifted closer during the morning, drawn by curiosity or by the hope that the shepherd's presence might mean something interesting was happening. A few of the younger lambs stood at a safe distance and watched him with their blank yellow eyes, their heads tilted slightly, as if trying to understand the purpose of the weaving. The black-faced ram who had caused the damage was among them, standing a little apart from the others, with his massive curled horns and his broad chest. He looked at the shepherd and then at the fence, and then back at the shepherd with an expression that contained no guilt or awareness, only the calm patience of an animal that would wait until the man left and then return to lean against the fence again. The shepherd looked at the ram and made a small sound in his throat that was not a word, but conveyed a general sense of acknowledgement. The ram blinked slowly and lowered his head to crop at a tuft of grass near his feet. When the bread was finished and the water bottle was stowed away again, the shepherd returned to the weaving. The new section of fence was growing under his hands, the pale fresh hazel rods standing out brightly against the grey weathered wood of the older sections on either side. The contrast would fade over the coming months as the sun and the rain worked on the new wood and turned it to the same silvery grey as the rest of the fence. For now it was a visible record of the morning's labour, a patch of lightness in the long dark line that stretched across the hillside. The final part of the repair was to secure the top rail with the hemp rope so that the ram's weight would not push it out of position again. The shepherd cut a short length of rope and wound it around the junction where the top rail crossed the end stake, tying a knot that he had learned so long ago he could not remember being taught it. The knot was simple and strong and would hold against any pressure the ram could apply. He tested it by pulling on the top rail with his full weight, and the fence held firm, the weave distributing the force across all the stakes and rods in a way that made the whole structure stronger than any single part. He stood up and brushed the chalk dust and the bits of bark from his tunic and his hands. The sun was now past its highest point and beginning the long, slow slide toward the western horizon. The light had softened from the harsh white of midday into a warmer gold that made the chalk of the distant cliffs glow and the green of the grass seem deeper and richer. He gathered his tools and the unused rods and the scraps of bark and the unusable old rods that he would take back to the hut to use as kindling for the fire. The bundle was heavier than it had been on the walk out, but the weight was a comfortable one, the weight of work completed and materials not wasted. He walked back along the contour of the valley with the bundle on his shoulder and the crook in his other hand. The sheep watched him pass with the same calm indifference they had shown all morning, their heads down and their jaws working in the steady rhythm of grazing. A wren flew out of a bramble bush near the path and scolded him briefly with a sharp chittering call before disappearing back into the thorns. The sound was the loudest thing in the quiet afternoon, a brief interruption in the soft background music of the grass being torn and the distant hiss of the tide on the shingle beach. At the hut, he stacked the usable rods against the north wall where they would stay dry and be ready for the next repair when it was needed. The scraps of bark and the rotten rods went into a pile near the doorway where they would dry in the sun and become fuel for the small fire he sometimes built on the flat stone outside to heat water or cook the occasional piece of meat given to him by the village at the foot of the downs. He put the hand axe and the coil of rope back in their niche and hung the leather water bottle on its peg. The work was finished, and the afternoon stretched out before him as a long, empty space to be filled with the usual small tasks of watching and waiting and simply being present on the hillside. He walked out to the flat flintstone and sat down with his back against the warm slope and his face turned toward the sea. The haze on the horizon was still there, a low bank of greyish-white that had not moved or changed since the fog lifted. He looked at it without curiosity or concern, his eyes resting on the distant blur in the same way they rested on the familiar shapes of the sheep and the valley. The sound of a hammer on iron did not carry across the water. The smell of pine pitch heating in copper pots did not reach his nose. There was only the quiet of the Sussex Downs in the late afternoon, the soft warmth of the September sun, and the slow, peaceful rhythm of a world that asked nothing of him but to watch and to wait and to mend what was broken when it needed mending. the night that followed the mending of the wattle fence, arrived with a clarity that was the twin of the day's clear sky, but transformed by the absence of the sun into something deeper and colder and vastly more distant. The shepherd had eaten his evening bread and had drunk the last of the water from the leather bottle, and had watched the final colour fade from the western sky where the sun had disappeared behind the haze bank that still lay low on the horizon. The colour had progressed through a sequence that he had witnessed so many thousands of times that he no longer noticed it as a sequence, but simply as the gradual dimming of the world into night. A pale yellow giving way to a dusty rose that deepened into a soft purple, and then into the blue-black of the upper sky, where the first stars were already pricking through. He sat on the flat flint stone during this transition, with his cloak wrapped around his shoulders against the cooling air, and his crook laid across his knees, and he did not move until the last trace of daylight had drained completely from the land, and the only illumination came from the sky itself. When the darkness was full and the hillside had become a landscape of soft black shapes, rather than distinct forms, the shepherd rose from the stone and walked a short distance up the slope to a spot he favoured for watching the night. This spot was a shallow depression in the turf where the grass grew particularly short and fine, a natural hollow that cupped his body when he lay down and sheltered him from the faint breeze that often moved across the ridge, even on still evenings. The depression had been formed by the weathering of a patch of softer chalk beneath the surface, or perhaps by the repeated bedding down of sheep over many generations, or perhaps by some combination of both. The shepherd did not know the origin of the hollow, and had never thought to wonder about it. He knew only that it fit the shape of his back and shoulders with a comfort that no bed of bracken inside the hut could match. He lowered himself onto the grass with the slow care of a man whose joints reminded him of their age in the cold and the damp, settling first onto his knees and then easing his weight backward until his spine met the curve of the hollow. The grass was cool against the back of his neck, where his hair had thinned, and the skin was exposed above the collar of his tunic. He shifted slightly to the left and then slightly to the right until the fit was perfect, and the pressure of the ground was distributed evenly along the length of his body. The cloak he spread beneath him like a thin mattress, the wool providing a layer of insulation between his back and the cooling earth. He folded his hands on his chest where they rose and fell with the slow rhythm of his breathing, and he turned his face upward toward the sky. The stars on a clear September night over the Sussex Downs were not scattered randomly, but arranged in patterns that the shepherd had known since he was a boy, lying in this same hollow, or one very like it, while his father pointed upward with a crooked finger and named the shapes that hung in the darkness. The names were old names, names that had been spoken on these hills long before the Romans came and built their roads and their villas in the valleys below. Names that belonged to the land and the sky and the people who had watched them both for more generations than anyone could count. The shepherd did not think of the names as history or as knowledge to be preserved. They were simply the words that attached themselves to the patterns, as natural and as unremarkable as the names he gave to his ewes based on the spots on their faces. The most prominent pattern in the northern sky was the group of 7 stars that he called the wagon. The wagon consisted of 4 bright points that formed a rough rectangle and 3 more that curved away from one corner in a line that suggested the shaft of a cart. The whole shape was tilted at an angle on this night, with the shaft pointing downward toward the dark mass of the land and the rectangle standing on its end. The shepherd watched the wagon without expectation or impatience, because he knew that over the course of the night the whole pattern would pivot slowly around a single fixed star that hung in the north and never moved from its position. This fixed star was the hub around which the entire sky turned, a steady point in a slow wheel of lights, and the shepherd sometimes used it to orient himself on nights when the fog or the clouds obscured the familiar shapes of the hills. He did not need such orientation now because he was lying in his own hollow, on his own hillside, and he knew exactly where he was. But the knowledge of the fixed star's presence was a comfort in the same way that the knowledge of the hut's location was a comfort even when he was standing directly beside it. The turning of the wagon around the fixed star was too slow to perceive in any given moment. The shepherd knew this from long experience and from the few times he had tried to watch for the motion itself and had fallen asleep before any change was detectable. The motion was a thing that revealed itself only across hours, the position of the wagon at midnight being noticeably different from its position at the first appearance of the stars after sunset, and different again from its position in the cold hour just before dawn. He did not need to see the motion to know that it was happening. The stars were a calendar written in light, a slow and patient record of the passing of the seasons that required no marks on a stick and no memory of days. Arcturus was the star that told him the time of year more clearly than any other. It hung in the western sky on this September evening, a bright point with a faint orange tint that distinguished it from the colder white of the surrounding stars. Arcturus was the brightest star in the constellation that the shepherd knew as the herdsman, a figure that stood guard over the wagon and the other northern patterns. In the summer months, Arcturus rode high in the sky at sunset and remained visible for most of the night, its brightness competing with the lingering twilight and sometimes appearing even before the sun had fully disappeared. But now in September, the star was lower at dusk and it set earlier, with each passing night, sinking toward the western horizon and disappearing behind the dark line of the downs before the midnight hour arrived. The shepherd observed its position on this evening and noted without conscious calculation that it stood perhaps 2 hand-widths above the haze bank, lower than it had been a week ago, and lower still than it would be a week hence. The descent of Arcturus was the measure of the seasons turning, a slow fall toward winter that matched the slow fall of the leaves in the weald and the slow thickening of the sheep's fleeces. The other stars that filled the sky were too numerous to count and too numerous to name, a dense scattering of bright points and faint points and points so dim that they could only be seen by looking slightly to the side of where they actually hung. The shepherd's eyes moved across this vast field of light without focusing on any particular star, his gaze soft and relaxed and his mind as empty of thought as the sky was empty of cloud. The longer he lay in the hollow and watched, the more stars seemed to appear, the fainter ones emerging from the darkness as his eyes adjusted to the absence of any other light. There was no moon yet to wash out the dimmer stars with its silver glow. The moon on this night was a waning crescent that would not rise until very late, long after the shepherd had returned to his hut, or perhaps not until the sky was already beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. The absence of moonlight made the stars seem closer and more numerous, a thick band of light that stretched across the sky from the northeastern horizon to the southwestern, a path of pale luminescence that the old stories called the Milky Way. The shepherd had heard the story of the Milky Way when he was a boy, a tale about a goddess spilling milk across the heavens, but he did not think of the story now as he watched the faint glow. He thought instead of the ewes in the valley below, their udders full and heavy with the milk that would nourish the lambs through the coming winter, and the thought was not a conscious comparison, but simply the natural association of a man whose life was bound up with sheep. The Milky Way was a path of spilled light, and the ewes were a source of spilled milk, and both things existed in the same world and were seen by the same eyes, and that was enough. The landward side of the downs was a wall of absolute blackness, against which the lower stars seemed to sit like jewels on dark velvet. There were no villages in that direction for many miles, no cook fires, no rushlights burning in the doorways of huts, no torches carried along the sunken lanes that wound through the weald. The forest that covered the lowlands was a place of deep shadow and ancient trees, inhabited by deer and boar and the few men who made their living as charcoal burners or swineherds. Those men did not keep lights burning through the night because light attracted attention, and attention was not always welcome in the deep woods. The shepherd knew the forest only as a dark line on the horizon during the day, and as a vast absence of light during the night, a place that was not his place and that asked nothing of him. He looked toward the landward darkness for a long while and saw nothing but the faintest suggestion of a hill closer than the forest, a rise in the downs that blocked the view of anything beyond. The darkness was complete and comforting in its completeness, a blanket that covered the sleeping land and held it quiet until the morning. The seaward side was different. The sea was never truly dark because the water caught and held whatever light the sky provided, reflecting the stars back as a faint shimmer that was more a texture than a brightness. The shepherd could not see the water itself from his position in the hollow because the curve of the hillside blocked the view, but he could see the effect of the water in the way the sky just above the southern horizon seemed slightly less dark than the sky in other directions. This pale suggestion was the accumulated reflection of all the stars on the moving surface of the channel, a whisper of silver that spoke of the vast body of water lying just beyond the cliffs. He listened to the sound of that water as he watched the stars, a distant hiss that rose and fell in a rhythm too slow to be called a rhythm. The sound of the tide moving against the shingle beach and the chalk cliffs and the long curve of the coast. The waning crescent moon would not rise for many hours yet, and the shepherd did not wait for it. He knew the shape of the moon on this night without needing to see it, because he had watched the moon cycle through its phases more times than he had watched the seasons turn. The waning crescent was the final phase before the new moon, a thin, curved sliver of light that appeared low in the eastern sky just before dawn and offered almost no illumination to the land. The shepherd had seen this phase many times, and he knew that the moon on such nights was a delicate thing, easily hidden by a wisp of cloud or by the haze that hung on the horizon. He did not need the moon's light to see the stars, and he did not need the moon's light to find his way back to the hut when he was ready to rise. The darkness of a moonless night on the downs was not a frightening thing to a man who knew every step of the ground and could walk the path from the hollow to the hut with his eyes closed and his mind elsewhere. He lay in the hollow for a long time without moving, his breathing slow and regular, and his eyes open to the sky. The stars turned above him in their patient arc, the wagon pivoting around the fixed star, Arcturus sinking toward the western horizon, the Milky Way flowing across the zenith in a pale river of light. The air grew colder as the night deepened, and the shepherd felt the chill seeping through the wool of his cloak and into his shoulders and hips. He did not rise immediately when he noticed the cold, but remained still for a while longer, allowing the sensation to be present without responding to it. The cold was not painful or dangerous. It was simply the natural temperature of a September night on the high downs, and his body was accustomed to it after a lifetime of sleeping in the hut with only a wool blanket and a bed of bracken for warmth. When he finally rose from the hollow, his joints protested with small aches that he ignored in the same way he ignored the cold. He stood for a moment with his face still turned upward, taking a final look at the sky before the walk back to the hut. The wagon had moved visibly since he first lay down, the shaft now pointing more directly downward, and the rectangle tilted farther toward the east. Arcturus was lower still, perhaps only a single hand width above the haze bank, and its orange tint was more pronounced as it approached the thicker air near the horizon. The shepherd noted these changes without counting them or marking them in any way, adding them to the vast store of observations that made up his understanding of the world. The walk back to the hut was a slow descent through the darkness, his feet finding the familiar path without the aid of his eyes. The crook tapped the ground ahead of him with each step, a sound that was both a guide and a company in the silent night. The sheep were settled in their hollow, pale shapes that he could sense more than see, their breathing a soft chorus of low sounds that blended with the distant hiss of the sea. He paused at the edge of their sleeping ground and listened to them for a moment, satisfying himself that all was well and that no animal was distressed or wandering. Then he continued on to the hut and ducked through the low doorway into the deeper darkness within. Inside the hut, he found his bed of bracken by touch and lowered himself onto it with the same slow care he had used in the hollow. The thatch above him was a black ceiling that he could not see, and the flint walls were black shapes that pressed close on either side. He pulled the wool blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes and listened to the silence of the night. A silence that was not empty, but full of small sounds that were too faint to be heard unless one listened for them. The rustle of a mouse in the dry grass outside the wall, the creak of a rafter settling as the temperature dropped, the distant cry of a fox somewhere down in the valley, and always and beneath everything else, the endless whisper of the tide on the shingle beach. The shepherd heard all of these sounds, and none of them disturbed him. He let them wash over him like the stars washing over the sky, a slow and patient presence that asked nothing and gave nothing, and simply was. His breathing slowed and deepened, matching the rhythm of the sheep in the hollow and the tide on the beach and the turning of the wagon around the fixed star. The night continued on without him, the stars completing their slow arc across the heavens, the waning crescent moon rising unseen in the east and climbing toward the zenith that it would not reach before the dawn. The shepherd slept and did not dream. Or if he dreamed, the dreams were of grass and wool, and the faces of ewes and the sound of the wind, dreams so quiet and so familiar that they left no trace in his memory when he woke. The calendar of the sky marked another night's passage, and the world turned toward the morning, and nothing had changed, and everything was as it should be. The depot lay in a shallow fold of the hillside about 200 paces to the east of the shepherd's hut, a place where the natural contours of the down created a slight depression that caught and held the rainfall of many centuries before anyone had thought to line the hollow with clay and straw. The pond was not a natural feature in the strict sense, because the chalk of the downs was porous and would not hold water on its own. Any depression in pure chalk drained away within hours of a rainstorm, the water seeping down through the white rock and into the deep aquifers that fed the springs in the valleys far below. The depot existed only because generations of shepherds before this shepherd had dug out the hollow and lined it with layer upon layer of puddled clay mixed with chopped straw, and then covered the hole with a thin skin of chalk rubble to protect the clay from the hooves of the sheep. The work had been done long ago by hands that were now bones in the churchyard of the village at the foot of the downs, and the pond had been maintained by other hands since then. Each shepherd adding his own layer of clay and his own basket of straw and his own patient hours of tamping and smoothing, until the basin held water through the driest months of summer. The shepherd walked to the depot on a morning when the sky was a pale washed blue and the air carried the first suggestion of the cooler days that would arrive with the turning of the month. He followed a path that was not marked by any sign, but existed as a slightly paler line in the turf, where his own feet and the feet of the shepherds before him, and the small sharp hooves of the sheep had worn the grass down to the chalk beneath over the course of countless journeys to and from the water. The path curved gently around a low rise and then descended into the shallow fold where the pond lay, a dark patch of water surrounded by a fringe of greener grass that grew more vigorously in the damp soil near the edge. The surface of the pond was perhaps 15 paces across at its widest point and shaped like an irregular oval that followed the natural contours of the depression. The water was still and dark and reflected the pale sky in a way that made it seem deeper than it actually was. The shepherd stopped at the edge of the pond and looked at the surface with the same calm attention he gave to the faces of his sheep. The water was low for the time of year because the late summer had been drier than usual, and the fog of the previous days had added moisture to the air, but not to the pond itself. The level had dropped perhaps the width of his hand since he had last paid close attention to it, exposing a band of dark clay around the perimeter where the water had been and was no longer. The clay was smooth and glistened slightly in the morning light, and a few small cracks had begun to form in the places where the sun reached the exposed surface for the longest part of the day. The cracks were thin and shallow and did not yet threaten the integrity of the lining, but the shepherd noted them and filed the observation away in the same part of his mind that held the condition of the wattle fence and the faces of the ewes. The surface of the water was not perfectly clean. A fine green dust of pollen from the late flowering grasses had settled on the surface during the still days of the past week, forming a thin film that shimmered with faint iridescence when the light caught it at certain angles. A few stray white feathers from a seagull floated near the center of the pond, their quills just touching the water and their veins spreading out like tiny sails. The shepherd saw these things and decided without any particular urgency that the pond needed to be skimmed, not because the pollen or the feathers would harm the sheep, but because a clean surface allowed the water to breathe and prevented the growth of the slimy green algae that could make the animals reluctant to drink. He walked around the edge of the pond to the far side, where a flat piece of bark leaned against a small cairn of flint stones that he had stacked there for this purpose. The bark was from an oak tree that had grown in the weald and had been brought up to the downs by some previous shepherd who had recognized the usefulness of a broad, curved piece of thick bark for skimming water. The bark was grey and weathered on the outer side and smooth and reddish-brown on the inner side where the living layer of the tree had once been. It was about the length of the shepherd's forearm and slightly wider than his hand, and it curved upward at the edges in a way that made it perfect for scooping debris from the surface of the pond without taking too much water with it. He picked up the bark and held it in his right hand, feeling the familiar weight and the smooth texture of the inner surface against his palm. The act of skimming the pond was a slow and patient process that could not be rushed, because any sudden movement would create ripples that pushed the floating debris away from the skimmer rather than drawing it in. The shepherd knelt at the edge of the water, where the grass was damp and the soil was soft under his knees. He leaned forward and dipped the curved edge of the bark just below the surface, then drew it toward himself with a motion so gentle that the water barely dimpled around the sides of the tool. The film of pollen, and the small floating bits of grass, and the white seagull feathers were caught in the curve of the bark and lifted from the pond with a soft sucking sound as the water drained away through the gaps at the edges. He turned and deposited the wet mass of debris on the grass behind him, then returned the bark to the water and repeated the motion. Each pass of the skimmer covered a strip of the pond's surface no wider than the bark itself, and the shepherd moved methodically from one side of the pond to the other, overlapping each strip slightly so that no patch of the film remained. The ripples from his movements spread outward in perfect concentric circles that traveled across the dark water and reflected the pale sky, and eventually reached the far shore, where they lapped against the exposed clay with a sound so faint it was more a sensation in the air than a noise. The ripples faded and the surface became still again, and the shepherd continued his slow work, his breathing steady and his eyes focused on the point where the bark met the water. The seagull feathers were the last things to be removed because they had drifted during the skimming and now clustered together near the center of the pond. The shepherd reached out as far as he could without overbalancing and caught the edge of the small white cluster with the tip of the bark, drawing the feathers slowly toward him until they were close enough to lift free. The feathers were wet and bedraggled and had lost the fluffy lightness they possessed when they were still attached to the bird. They lay in the bark like a small sodden pillow, and the shepherd added them to the pile of debris on the grass where they would dry in the sun and eventually be scattered by the wind. When the surface of the pond was clean and clear, and reflected the sky without the interruption of the green film, the shepherd sat back on his heels and looked at the water with satisfaction. The satisfaction was not a strong emotion, but a quiet sense of something having been done that needed doing. A small completion in a day that would hold many such small completions. The water was now a dark mirror that showed the pale blue of the sky and the thin white streaks of cloud that had begun to form high above the downs. The reflection was so still and so perfect that the pond seemed to contain another sky within itself, a second heavens that lay just beneath the surface and moved only when the shepherd dipped the bark in again. He used the bark one more time to scoop up a small amount of water and bring it to his lips. The water was cool and tasted faintly of the clay that lined the pond and more distantly of the chalk aquifer from which the original rain had fallen many months ago. There was no metallic taste and no unpleasant murkiness, because the clay and the straw lining filtered the water in a slow, natural process that left it clear and clean. He drank only a small amount, because the water in the deep pond was precious and was meant primarily for the sheep, who had no other source on the high downs. His own drinking water came from a spring that emerged from the chalk at the foot of the cliffs, a place he visited every few days to fill the leather bottle that hung on the north wall of the hut. The taste of the pond water was a reminder of that spring, and of the long walk down to the shore and back, a walk he would make tomorrow or the next day when the leather bottle ran dry. After drinking, he remained kneeling at the edge of the pond for a while longer, his hands resting on his thighs and his eyes moving slowly over the surface of the water. The stillness of the pond after the skimming was a deep and complete stillness that seemed to draw the surrounding world into itself. The grass at the edge of the water was reflected as a fringe of green that trembled slightly in the faint breeze. The sky above was reflected as a pale dome that curved away in all directions, and in the exact center of the pond, where the water was deepest and the light penetrated farthest, a small dark shape was moving with a slow and deliberate purpose. The shape was a water beetle, a creature about the length of the shepherd's thumbnail, with a glossy black carapace that gleamed like polished horn. It rode itself across the surface of the pond with its long hind legs, each stroke pushing it forward in a smooth glide that left a tiny V-shaped wake spreading out behind it. The shepherd watched the beetle without moving, his eyes following its progress from one side of the pond to the other. The journey took a long time because the beetle moved slowly and because it stopped frequently to float motionless on the surface, as if considering its direction or simply resting. The shepherd did not count the time and did not grow impatient. He simply watched the small dark shape make its way across the great circle of reflected sky. The beetle reached the far side of the pond after a period of time that could not be measured in any way that mattered. It bumped gently against a blade of grass that hung over the water and then turned and began to row itself back in the direction from which it had come. The shepherd watched this return journey with the same calm attention he had given to the outward passage, his mind empty of any thought beyond the simple observation of the beetle's progress. The creature's legs moved in a steady rhythm that was visible as a faint blur against the dark water, and its body left a trail of tiny ripples that spread and faded and were replaced by new ripples with each stroke. When the beetle had returned to approximately the place where it had started, it stopped rowing and allowed itself to sink slowly beneath the surface. The shepherd watched it disappear into the dark water, and then he watched the place where it had been until the ripples faded and the surface was once again a perfect mirror of the sky. He rose from his kneeling position with the same slow care he used for all his movements, his knees protesting slightly from the damp and the pressure of the ground. He picked up the piece of bark and returned it to its place against the flint cairn, and he scattered the pile of wet debris with his foot so that it would dry and blow away rather than rotting in a heap. The walk back to the hut followed the same pale line in the turf that had brought him to the pond. The sun was higher now, and the warmth of the morning had burned off the last of the dew from the grass. The sheep had drifted during his absence and were now spread across the middle slope of the valley where the grass was sweetest and most abundant. He paused in his walk to look at them and saw that the black-faced ram was standing near the repaired section of the wattle fence, with his head turned toward the yarrow on the far side. The fence held firm against his leaning weight, the new hazel rods pale and straight against the older grey wood, and the ram eventually turned away and walked back toward the main flock with a slow and dignified stride. The shepherd continued to the hut and sat on the wooden stool just inside the doorway where the morning sun fell across his legs and warmed the wool of his tunic. From this position he could see the Debby Pond as a small dark patch in the fold of the hill, its surface glinting occasionally when the light caught it at the right angle. He thought about the water that lay in that shallow basin, water that had fallen as rain on some distant day and had been held by the clay and the straw against the thirsty chalk. The sheep would come to drink in the late afternoon, when the heat of the day had passed and their grazing had made them thirsty. They would approach the pond in small groups and lower their heads to the dark water and drink with a soft lapping sound that carried across the still air of the evening. The shepherd had watched this ritual more times than he could remember, and he would watch it again today and tomorrow and all the days after that until the winter rains came and filled the pond to overflowing and the cycle began again. The water beetle was somewhere beneath the surface now, swimming in the cool darkness or resting on the clay bottom or clinging to a submerged stem of grass. The shepherd did not think about the beetle in particular, but his awareness of the pond included the beetle and the feathers and the pollen and the clay and the straw and the generations of hands that had built and maintained the basin. All of these things existed together in the quiet fold of the hill, and the shepherd existed among them, and the afternoon stretched out ahead with the slow and patient rhythm of the water and the grass and the turning of the sky above the downs. The angle of the sun in the third week of September was noticeably different from its angle in August, a change that the shepherd felt as much as he saw, because the warmth on his face arrived from a lower point in the southern sky, and the shadows that accompanied him on his afternoon walks had stretched from short dark pools at his feet into long blue shapes that reached across the grass like pointing fingers. The equinox was approaching, that moment in the turning of the year when the night balanced each other for a single breath before the darkness began its slow gain over the light. The shepherd did not know the word equinox, and would not have understood it if someone had spoken it to him, but he knew the thing itself in the same way. He knew the faces of his ewes and the texture of the chalk soil. The thing was a quality of the air and a particular slant of the sunlight, and a feeling in his bones that the world was tipping gently toward the cold and the dark. He stood on the crest of the ridge in the early afternoon, with his crook planted in the turf beside him, and his weight resting easily on his right leg, while his left leg was slightly bent to accommodate the slope of the ground. The position was one he had assumed thousands of times in this exact spot, and his body fell into it without conscious direction, the muscles and the joints remembering the angle and the balance and the distribution of weight that allowed him to stand for long periods without fatigue. From this vantage point he could see the flock spread out below him on the seaward slope, their white shapes glowing in the pale golden light of the declining sun. The shadows that stretched out from each sheep were remarkable in their length, reaching perhaps 10 or 12 paces down the hillside, and overlapping with the shadows of other sheep to create a complex pattern of light and dark that shifted very slowly as the animals moved and grazed. The quality of the light itself had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to a man who spent his entire life outdoors and whose eyes were trained to read the sky and the land as other men read marks on parchment. The light of high summer was a harsh white gold that seemed to press down on the world from directly overhead, flattening the contours of the hills and washing the color out of the grass. The light of late September was softer and yellower and came from a source that hung lower in the southern sky, casting long shadows that revealed every fold and undulation of the turf in sharp relief. The shepherd could see the individual tussocks of grass on the far side of the valley, now in a way that he could not in July, each small mound of thicker growth casting its own tiny shadow and creating a texture on the hillside that was visible even from this distance. The color of the sky in the late afternoon had deepened from the pale washed blue of morning into a richer shade that held a hint of something darker at its edges. The shepherd noticed this color without naming it, his eyes registering the change in the same way they registered the position of the flock and the direction of the wind. The wind on this afternoon was from the southwest, as it nearly always was, a steady breeze that pushed against his left cheek and carried the familiar smell of the sea and the damp chalk and the faint animal scent of the sheep. The breeze was cool but not cold, and it ruffled the outer layer of his wool cloak in a way that made a soft brushing sound against his shoulder. He turned his face slightly into the wind and let it wash over him, his eyes half closed and his mind empty of any particular thought. The shadows continued to lengthen as the afternoon wore on, stretching farther down the hillside with each passing hour. The shepherd descended from the crest and walked among the flock with his slow and steady pace, his own shadow moving beside him like a silent companion that grew and shrank depending on the angle of the ground. The shadow was a distorted version of himself, the head small and the legs impossibly long, and it rippled over the uneven turf in a way that was almost amusing if the shepherd had been a man who found amusement in such things. He did not find it amusing, but he noted it in the same way he noted everything else, adding the observation to the vast store of small details that made up his understanding of the world. The grass on the seaward slope had begun to take on a slightly different color in the changing light, the green deepening towards something that was not quite brown, but was no longer the bright fresh green of spring and early summer. The shepherd noticed this change as he walked, and he knew that it meant the grass was preparing for the winter, drawing its energy down into the roots and allowing the blades to harden and fade. The sheep did not seem to mind the change in the grass because they continued to graze with the same steady, tearing sound, their heads down and their jaws working in the rhythm that was the background music of the shepherd's life. The wool on their backs was thick and full now, the growth of the summer having reached its peak, and the animals looked larger and rounder than they had in the thinner months of spring. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western horizon, where the haze banks still lay low and grey and featureless. The shepherd stopped his walking and stood for a while near the flat flintstone, watching the light change and the shadows grow. The particular hue of the sky just before dusk was a thing he had seen more times than he could count, but it never failed to hold his attention for a few quiet moments. The color began as a pale, watery yellow that filled the entire western half of the sky and seemed to drain the blue from the rest of the heavens. Then as the sun dropped lower, the yellow deepened into a dusty rose that spread upward from the horizon like a slow stain, touching the undersides of the few thin clouds that hung high above the sea. The rose faded at its upper edges into a soft purple that was almost grey, and the purple faded into the blue-black of the eastern sky where the first faint stars were already beginning to appear. The shepherd watched this progression without impatience or expectation, his eyes moving slowly across the coloured sky and his breathing steady and deep. The sheep had begun to drift toward their sleeping hollow as the light faded, their internal sense of the day's rhythm telling them that the time for grazing was ending and the time for rest was approaching. They moved in small groups and single-file lines, their white bodies glowing softly in the dusk, and their long shadows now merged into a single dark tide that flowed down the hillside ahead of them. The sound of their movement was a soft rustling of wool and a gentle padding of hooves on the turf, sounds so familiar to the shepherd that he heard them without listening. It was in this quiet moment between the day and the night that the wind shifted. The change was abrupt and unexpected, a sudden swing from the southwest to the southeast that the shepherd felt as a cool pressure on his right cheek, where the air had been warm from the lingering sun. He turned his head toward the new wind and sniffed the air in the same way he had sniffed the air 1,000 times before, sampling the scents that the breeze carried to learn what he could about the world beyond his valley. The first thing he noticed was that the sea smell was gone, replaced by something that was not the smell of the downs at all. The new scent was faint and acrid, and carried a suggestion of smoke, not the clean wood smoke of a cook fire or a charcoal burner's pit, but something sharper and more extensive. There was a metallic tang beneath the smoke as well, a smell of the shepherd associated with the blacksmith's forge in the village at the foot of the downs, but which here was carried on a wind that came from the sea where there was no village and no forge. He stood very still and breathed the strange air for a long moment, his brow furrowing slightly with the effort of identifying something that did not belong to his familiar world of scents. The smell was like a hedgerow fire that had burned out of control and consumed more than just the dry brush, or like the smell that rose from a patch of ground where lightning had struck a dead tree and smouldered in the roots for days. But the wind was from the southeast, and the southeast was the channel, and there were no hedgerows or dead trees on the open water. The shepherd thought of the charcoal burners in the Weald, whose smoke sometimes drifted up to the downs on a north wind, but this wind was from the sea, and the Weald lay to the north and east. The smell could not be from the Weald. He sniffed again, and the acrid scent was fainter now, already fading as the wind continued its shift and began to swing back toward its usual southwest quarter. The shepherd stood and waited, while the breeze settled back into its familiar pattern, and the strange smell dissipated into the clean salt air that he had known all his life. Within a few dozen heartbeats the acrid tang was gone completely, and the only scent on the wind was the damp chalk and the sheep and the distant sea. The shepherd relaxed his shoulders and dismissed the memory of the strange smell in the same way he dismissed the memory of a dream upon waking. It had been his imagination, or some trick of the evening air, or a stray scent carried on a freak gust from a source that did not concern him. He did not think about it again. The dusk had deepened while he stood sniffing the wind, and the colours in the western sky had faded from rose and purple to a uniform grey that was the last light before the true darkness of night. The shepherd turned his back to the sea and walked toward the hut, with his crook tapping the ground ahead of him in the familiar rhythm. The sheep were settled in their hollow, pale shapes that he could sense more than see, and their low breathing sounds reached his ears as a soft chorus of comfort and routine. He ducked through the low doorway of the hut and found his bed of bracken in the dark, and lay down with his cloak pulled over him against the cooling night air. Outside the hut the wind continued to blow from the southwest, and the strange acrid smell did not return. The haze bank on the horizon was invisible in the darkness, but it was still there, a low grey presence that hung over the water and hid whatever lay beyond. The shepherd closed his eyes and listened to the distant hiss of the tide and the nearer rustle of the thatch in the breeze. His breathing slowed and deepened, and his mind let go of the small puzzle of the strange wind and the acrid smell. The equinox was approaching, and the shadows were growing longer, and the world was tipping gently toward the winter. Everything was as it should be on the quiet downs, and the shepherd slept. The next morning arrived with a sky that was clear and pale, and a wind that blew steadily from the southwest as if it had never shifted at all. The shepherd walked out to the crest of the ridge and looked toward the sea out of habit rather than expectation. The haze bank was still there, low and grey and featureless, and the water below it was a flat expanse of greenish grey that merged with the haze of the horizon. He stood for a while with his face turned into the familiar wind and breathed the familiar air, and let the memory of the strange scent fade even further into the background of his awareness, where it joined all the other small anomalies that had no explanation and required none. The afternoon of that day was a repetition of the afternoon before, with the sun angling lower in the south and the shadows stretching longer across the grass. The shepherd sat on the flat flint stone and watched a spider repairing a tear in its web that was strung between two stalks of knapweed near the edge of the dry stream bed. The spider was small and brown and moved with a quick precision that the shepherd found calming to observe. It travelled back and forth along the broken strands, pulling silk from its body and attaching it to the undamaged portions of the web, gradually restoring the geometric pattern that the wind or a passing bird had disrupted during the night. The shepherd watched the spider for a long time without moving, his eyes following the small creature's progress and his mind empty of any thought beyond the simple observation of the repair work. The web, when it was finished, was a perfect circle of delicate threads that caught the afternoon light and held it in tiny points of silver. The spider settled in the center of its restored creation and remained motionless, waiting for the small flying insects that would become its evening meal. The shepherd rose from the flintstone and walked back toward the flock, his shadow stretching long and blue across the grass ahead of him. The equinox was only a few days away, and the balance of light and dark was shifting, and the smell of distant burning had faded into the clean salt air of the channel. The downs were quiet, and the sheep were grazing, and the world continued to turn in its slow and patient way, asking nothing of the shepherd but to watch and to wait, and to be present in the long shadows of the afternoon. The cloak was the first thing the shepherd reached for each morning, and the last thing he put aside each night, a garment so constant in his life that it had become less an article of clothing and more a part of his own body, extended outward into wool and weight and warmth. He had worn this same cloak through 3 full winters and the greater parts of 3 springs and 3 autumns, and the fabric had shaped itself to the particular contours of his shoulders and the curve of his spine and the way his left arm tended to hang slightly lower than his right from years of carrying the crook in that hand. The wool had compressed in the places where his body pressed against it most often, the back of the neck and the points of the shoulders and the small of the back, creating subtle hollows and thin spots that were invisible to anyone looking at the garment, but which the shepherd could feel with his fingers in the dark. He knew the cloak in the same way he knew the faces of his ewes and the path to the depend and the sound of the wind from the southwest. The outer layer of the cloak was woven from the coarsest wool of the flock, the long, straight fibers that grew on the backs and flanks of the older ewes, and which were separated during the shearing and set aside for the making of garments that needed to withstand weather rather than provide softness against the skin. These outer fibers were undyed and retained the natural colors of the sheep from which they came, a range of grays that shifted from the pale silvery shade of a morning mist to the deep charcoal of a storm cloud. The wool had been spun on a drop spindle by a woman in the village whose face the shepherd could picture if he tried, but whose name he had never learned, the thread twisting and plying and winding onto the shaft in a rhythm that matched the rhythm of the turning seasons. The weaving had been done on a loom that stood against the wall of a cottage with a packed earth floor and a roof of reed thatch, the shuttle passing back and forth and the beater bar pressing each new thread against the ones that came before until the fabric was dense and tight and nearly impervious to the wind. The shepherd ran his hand over the surface of the cloak as he sat on the wooden stool outside the hut in the late afternoon, the light already beginning to soften and thicken into the quality that belonged to the hour before dusk. The wool under his palm was rough and slightly prickly, the individual fibers standing away from the weave in a fine nap that caught the angled sunlight and held it in a soft grey glow. The nap was longer in some places than in others because the cloak had been worn against the grain on his left shoulder, where the bronze pin pressed the fabric against his body and rubbed the fibers in the opposite direction from their natural lie. This patch of reversed nap was darker than the surrounding wool because the light struck it at a different angle and because the lanolin from the sheep had been worked deeper into the fibers by the constant friction of the pin. The lanolin was the substance that gave the cloak its particular weight and its resistance to the damp. It was a grease produced by the skin of the sheep that coated each fiber of wool as it grew and remained in the fleece even after the spinning and the weaving and the wearing. The shepherd could smell the lanolin when he brought the fabric close to his face, a warm animal odor that was not strong but was unmistakable, the scent of the flock and the fold and the long nights in the hut with the rushlight burning. The lanolin repelled water in the same way that the oil on a duck's feathers repelled water, causing the moisture from the fog or the light rain to bead up on the surface of the cloak rather than soaking into the fibers. The weight of the garment increased when it was wet because the water filled the spaces between the threads even as it was kept from the threads themselves, and the shepherd had learned to judge the dampness of the air by the heaviness of the cloak on his shoulders. Beneath the coarse outer layer there was a lining of softer wool that had been taken from the bellies of the younger ewes where the fleece grew fine and short and pale. This inner wool was a warm brownish cream color that came from sheep who had more of the dark pigment in their skin and whose belly wool retained a hint of that darkness even after the sun had bleached their backs to silver. The lining was not a separate piece of fabric sewn to the outer layer, but rather a second weaving that had been done on the same loom in a different pattern, the threads finer and the weave looser, so that the fabric was lighter and more flexible. The two layers were joined at the edges with a simple running stitch of coarse linen thread that had been waxed with beeswax to resist the damp. The shepherd could feel the transition from the rough outer wool to the soft inner wool when he wrapped the cloak around himself, the coarse layer pressing against the back of his neck and the backs of his hands, while the soft layer rested against his tunic and his arms and the sides of his body. The cloak was secured at the left shoulder with a bronze pin that was the most valuable object the shepherd owned. The pin was shaped like a serpent curled into a circle with its tail passing through its mouth, a design that had been made by a metal worker in Lewis many years ago and had been traded for a fleece of particularly fine wool. The bronze was dark now with age and handling, a deep brownish green that showed the reddish metal only in the scratches and worn spots where the shepherd's fingers had rubbed against it thousands of times. The pin was heavy in his hand when he unfastened it each night, a solid weight that spoke of the value of the metal and the skill of the maker. He would hold it for a moment in his palm before setting it on the small ledge above his bed of bracken, feeling the warmth that the bronze had absorbed from his body through the layers of wool. The weight of the entire cloak when it was dry was perhaps the same as a half-grown lamb, a burden that the shepherd noticed only when he first lifted it from the peg in the morning and when he hung it back on the peg at night. During the hours between, he did not feel the weight as a separate thing, because it was distributed across his shoulders and his back and his arms in a way that his body had long since accepted as normal. The cloak moved with him when he walked, the folds shifting and settling with each step, and the sound of the fabric brushing against itself was a soft whisper that accompanied him everywhere he went on the downs. He was so accustomed to this sound that he noticed it only when it was absent, on the rare days when the wind was strong enough to hold the cloak tight against his body and prevent the fabric from moving. The afternoon had worn on into the early part of the evening, while the shepherd sat on his stool and attended to the small details of the cloak. The sun was now low enough that its light came almost horizontally across the valley, turning the grass to a pale gold and the chalk outcrops to a warm cream. The sheep had begun to drift toward their sleeping hollow as they always did at this hour, their internal sense of the day's rhythm telling them that the time for grazing was ending and the time for rest was approaching. The shepherd watched them move across the hillside with his eyes half closed against the low sun, his body still and his breathing slow, and the weight of the cloak a familiar presence on his shoulders. He rose from the stool after a while and walked out to the flat flint stone where he often sat to watch the final fading of the light. The stone was still warm from the afternoon sun, and the warmth seeped through his woolen tunic and into the muscles of his lower back as he settled onto its familiar surface. He adjusted the cloak around himself, pulling the left side over his right shoulder so that the fabric covered his chest in a double layer and trapped a pocket of warm air against his body. The right side of the cloak hung loose over his left arm and draped across his lap, the weight of the wool pressing his tunic against his thighs and keeping the chill of the evening from reaching his skin. The dusk came on slowly as it always did, the light fading by such small increments that the shepherd could not identify the moment when the world changed from day to night. The colors of the hillside shifted through the familiar sequence that he had witnessed so many thousands of times that he no longer saw it as a sequence, but simply as the gradual dimming of the world. The pale gold of the grass deepened into a soft brown, and then into a grey that was almost blue. The cream of the chalk outcrops cooled to a flat white and then disappeared into the general darkness of the hillside. The sky above the western horizon held its color the longest, a band of pale yellow that faded into a dusty rose and then into a purple so deep it was nearly black. The shepherd watched this band of color without expectation or desire, his eyes resting on the distant line where the sky met the sea and the haze bank lay hidden in the gathering dark. The sheep had reached their sleeping hollow and were settling themselves for the night with the same slow care that the shepherd used when he arranged his bed of bracken. Each ewe chose a spot on the ground and lowered herself onto her folded legs with a soft grunt of effort and a rustle of wool against wool. The lambs pressed themselves against their mother's flanks and tucked their heads under the warm curves of the older animals' bellies. The black-faced ram stood for a while at the edge of the hollow, with his great curled horns silhouetted against the fading sky. Then he too lowered himself to the ground and folded his legs beneath him, and rested his heavy head on the turf. The sound of the flock settling was a low chorus of small noises that blended together into a single soft murmur. The rustle of fleeces and the sigh of breath and the occasional low bleat of a lamb who had not yet found its comfortable position. The shepherd listened to these sounds from his place on the flintstone, his ears picking out the individual voices within the chorus in the same way his eyes picked out the individual faces of the ewes within the flock. He knew the sound of the old ewe with the mismatched horns settling down, with a particular wheeze that came from her chest. He knew the sound of the ewe with the dark patch on her nose, who always turned in a full circle before lying down, her hooves scraping the turf in a soft rhythm. He knew the sound of the smallest lamb who tended to wander, and who always took the longest to find its place against its mother's side, its small bleats carrying across the quiet evening air until finally they ceased and the flock was silent. The silence that followed the settling of the sheep was not an empty silence, but a full one, a quiet that was made of many small sounds that were too faint to be heard unless one listened for them. The shepherd sat on the warm stone and listened to the silence, and let it wash over him like the fading light. The distant hiss of the tide on the shingle beach was the deepest note in this quiet, a continuous whisper that rose and fell in a rhythm too slow to be called a rhythm. Nearer at hand there was the rustle of a mouse in the dry grass at the base of the flintstone, a tiny sound that came and went as the small creature moved through the stems. Above his head the first bats of the evening were beginning to flit across the darkening sky, their wings making a sound so high and faint that it was more a sensation in the air than a noise. And beneath all of these sounds there was the low rumbling belch of a ewe chewing her cud, a deep and satisfied noise that spoke of grass and rest and the slow work of digestion that would continue through the night. The shepherd's own body was still and quiet, his breathing slow and regular, and his hands resting on his thighs with the weight of the cloak pressing them down. He could feel the texture of the wool under his palms and the slight roughness of the outer layer and the softness of the inner layer where the cloak was doubled over his lap. The bronze pin at his shoulder was a small point of coolness against the warmth of his neck, and the edge of the cloak where it crossed his chest was a line of slightly different temperature that he could trace with his awareness if he chose to. He did not choose to trace it, but he was aware of it in the same way he was aware of the position of the sheep and the direction of the wind and the slow turning of the stars that would soon appear in the darkening sky. The world had reduced itself to a circle of sounds no wider than the shepherd's own hearing. Within this circle there was the soft breath of the flock, and the rustle of the mouse and the whisper of the tide and the occasional low sound of a ewe shifting her weight on the turf. Beyond the circle there was nothing, or rather there were things that made no sound that could reach him on his hillside. The great gathering of ships in the estuary across the water was silent, in the way that distance and water and the curve of the earth made all things silent. The sound of hammers and voices and the creak of timber and the slap of water against hulls did not carry across the miles of open sea. The smell of pine pitch and wood smoke and the metallic tang of iron did not reach the downs. There was only the quiet of the evening and the weight of the wool cloak and the slow settling of the world into darkness. The shepherd rose from the flintstone when the last colour had faded from the western sky, and the stars had begun to appear in the blue-black dome above. His joints protested the movement with small aches that he ignored, and the cloak shifted on his shoulders and resettled itself into its familiar position. He walked the short distance to the hut, with his crook tapping the ground ahead of him, the sound swallowed by the close air of the evening. At the doorway he paused and turned to look back at the hollow where the flock slept, a pale patch of white shapes against the dark turf. The sheep were still and quiet, and the shepherd could feel their presence, even though he could barely see them. He ducked through the low doorway and found his bed of bracken in the dark, and lay down with the cloak still wrapped around him for warmth against the cooling night. He did not remove the cloak to sleep, because the night air on the downs in late September was cold enough to seep through the flint walls and the thatch roof and find the body of a sleeping man. Instead, he pulled the fabric tighter around himself and arranged the folds so that his feet were covered and his neck was wrapped and only his face was exposed to the air of the hut. The weight of the cloak was a comfort in the darkness, a steady pressure that held him in place on his bed of bracken. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the night that were the same sounds he had listened to on every night of his life on the downs. The rustle of the thatch and the faint breeze and the distant hiss of the tide and the near silence of the sleeping flock and the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing. The cloak held him, and the night held the cloak, and the downs held them all in their patient and unchanging embrace. The shepherd slept, and the weight of the wool pressed him gently into the bracken, and the world continued to turn in its slow and quiet way toward the morning. The day that followed the evening of the heavy cloak arrived without a breath of wind, a thing so rare on the Sussex Downs that the shepherd noticed the stillness before he had fully opened his eyes. The absence of sound was what woke him, or rather the presence of a silence that was different from the usual quiet of the early morning. On a normal day, the wind made itself known even inside the hut as a faint pressure against the flint walls and a soft sigh through the gaps in the thatch, a constant companion that was always present even when it was too gentle to be called a breeze. On this morning there was no pressure and no sigh and no movement of the air at all. The world outside the hut was as still as the water in the deep pond, and the stillness pressed against the shepherd's ears with a weight that was almost physical. He rose from his bed of bracken and pushed aside the leather flap that covered the doorway and stepped out into a morning that seemed to have been painted onto the sky rather than existing as a living thing. The grass stood upright and motionless, each blade separate and distinct in a way that was only possible when there was no wind to blend them together into a single rippling surface. The sheep on the far slope were white shapes that might have been carved from chalk for all the movement they made, their heads down and their bodies still, and their jaws working in the only motion that disturbed the perfect quiet of the hillside. The sky above was a pale and even blue that held no clouds and no birds and no variation of color from horizon to horizon. The sea below the cliffs was a flat grey-green expanse that merged with the sky at the distant line of the haze bank, without any visible boundary between water and air. The shepherd stood in the doorway for a long time without moving, his crook held loosely in his right hand and his cloak hanging from his shoulders with a weight that seemed greater in the absence of any breeze to lift its edges. The stillness was so complete that he could hear sounds that were normally lost in the constant whisper of the wind. He could hear the blood moving in his own ears, a faint rushing that was always present but rarely noticed. He could hear the soft tearing of grass from the nearest ewe, who was grazing perhaps 50 paces down the slope, each individual rip of the blades distinct and separate in the quiet air. He could hear the distant lap of water against the shingle beach far below, a sound that was usually a continuous hiss but which now resolved into individual small splashes that occurred at irregular intervals and then faded back into the general murmur of the tide. He walked to the crest of the ridge with a pace that was slower even than his usual slow walk, his sandals pressing the grass flat and leaving dark footprints in the dew that would remain visible for hours, in the absence of any wind to disturb the turf. The sea was a mirror that reflected the pale sky with such perfect fidelity that the shepherd could not tell where the water ended and the air began. The haze bank that had hung on the horizon for so many days was still there, a low grey line that was the only feature in the otherwise featureless expanse. But even the haze seemed still and solid in the windless air, a bank of cloud that had forgotten how to move and simply hung above the water, like a forgotten thought. It was while he stood on the crest looking out over the channel that the shepherd noticed the cloud. It had not been there when he first looked, or perhaps it had been there, but had been too small and too distant to register against the pale uniformity of the sky. Now it was visible as a white shape that sat directly on top of the haze bank, a single cumulus cloud that had formed in the still air above the warmer water and had grown into a mass of brilliant white that caught the morning sun and held it in curves and hollows of light and shadow. The cloud was not like the thin streaks of cirrus that sometimes painted the high sky, or the flat grey sheets of stratus that brought the rain. It was a cloud of the kind that appeared on summer afternoons when the land heated the air and sent it rising in great columns of invisible moisture that condensed into towering shapes of white. But this was late September, and the land was cool and the cloud was alone, and it hung above the haze bank without moving. The shepherd sat down on the grass at the crest of the ridge, with his crook laid across his knees and his eyes fixed on the distant cloud. The shape of it was familiar in a way that he could not name, a form that suggested something he had seen before but which remained just beyond the edge of recognition. As he watched, the shape resolved itself in his mind into the image of a castle keep, a great square tower with battlements along the top and a single narrow window in the upper portion. The crenellations were formed by the billowing upper edge of the cloud, where the rising air had pushed the white vapor into rounded turrets that caught the sun more brightly than the body of the tower below. The window was a gap in the cloud where a darker patch of sky showed through, a rectangular opening that seemed to look out over the water toward the unseen coast of the land that lay beyond the haze. The shepherd had never seen a castle keep except in the stories told by travellers who passed through the village at the foot of the Downs on their way to Lewes or London. The stories described great towers of stone that rose above the wooden halls of the lords who ruled the land. Towers with walls so thick that a man could walk inside them and windows so narrow that an arrow could be shot out but not in. The shepherd had listened to these stories with the same calm attention he gave to everything else and had filed them away in his memory without any particular longing to see such a tower for himself. The Downs were his world, and the hut was his keep, and the flock was his domain, and he needed no walls of stone to tell him who he was or where he belonged. The cloud that looked like a castle keep did not move. The shepherd watched it for the duration of the time it took the sun to climb from the horizon to a point perhaps a hand's width above the haze bank, and in all that time the cloud remained exactly where it had first appeared. It did not drift to the east as clouds usually drifted on the prevailing wind, because there was no wind to carry it. It did not grow taller or wider, or change its shape because the air was too still to feed its growth or tear at its edges. It simply hung above the water like a painting on the wall of the sky, a white tower that guarded nothing and threatened nothing, and asked nothing of the shepherd but to be observed. The morning passed in this observation. The shepherd did not count the time, and did not grow impatient with the stillness of the cloud, because impatience was a thing that had been worn out of him by years of watching sheep and waiting for seasons and sitting on the flintstone while the light faded from the sky. He understood waiting in a way that was not conscious, but was instead a part of his body and his breath, and the slow rhythm of his heart. Waiting was not an activity that one did while expecting something to happen. Waiting was simply the condition of existing in the pause between one thing and another, and the pause itself was as full and as real as the things that bordered it. The cloud waited above the water, and the shepherd waited on the hillside, and the flock waited on the slope below, their grazing slowed by the heatless warmth of the September sun, and their bodies still in the windless air. The sheep did not move far from their morning positions because the grass was good where they stood, and there was no breeze to carry the scent of sweeter grazing from another part of the valley. They tore at the blades with their steady rhythm and chewed with their slow grinding motion, and occasionally lifted their heads to look around with their blank yellow eyes before lowering them again to the turf. The black-faced ram stood apart from the ewes as he always did, his great horns catching the light and his broad chest facing toward the sea, as if he too was watching the unmoving cloud. The shepherd's mind during the long morning was not empty of thought, but was filled with a kind of thinking that was more like watching than like the active pursuit of ideas. He thought about the nature of the cloud and the way the water vapor had risen from the warm sea and condensed into a shape that resembled something made by men. He thought about the stories of castle keeps and the men who lived in them, and the lives they led that was so different from his own life on the Downs. He thought about the fact that he would never see such a keep with his own eyes, and that he felt no regret about this fact, because the Downs were enough, and the flock was enough, and the slow turning of the seasons was enough. The thoughts moved through his awareness like the cloud moved across the sky, which was to say that they did not move at all but simply existed in a state of patient suspension. The sun reached its highest point in the southern sky and began the long, slow descent toward the west. The cloud had still not moved. Its shape had changed in small ways that the shepherd noticed because he had been watching it for so long. The battlements along the top had softened slightly as the rising air that fed the cloud weakened with the cooling of the afternoon. The window in the upper portion had narrowed as the edges of the gap drew closer together, the darker patch of sky shrinking until it was no larger than a man's hand held at arm's length. The base of the tower had flattened and spread slightly so that the whole shape was now less like a keep and more like a great anvil of white, resting on the grey anvil of white, resting on the grey anvil of the haze bank. But the cloud had not drifted and had not dispersed, and had not done any of the things that clouds normally did. It remained fixed above the water as if anchored to something invisible that lay beneath the surface. The shepherd ate a piece of the hard barley bread and drank from the leather bottle that he had brought with him to the crest of the ridge. The water was cool and tasted of the chalk spring and the leather and the long walk up from the shore. He chewed the bread slowly and swallowed and felt the familiar weight of it in his stomach. The cloud watched him from across the water with its one remaining eye of darker sky, and he watched the cloud with his two eyes of pale grey that had seen so many clouds come and go over the years. Neither of them moved. The afternoon wore on, and the stillness continued. The shepherd noticed that the sound of the sea had changed during the hours he had been sitting on the crest. The distant hiss of the tide was still present, but it was fainter now and more intermittent, as if the water itself had grown tired of moving and was settling into the same patient pause that held the cloud and the air and the grass. The individual splashes that he had heard in the early morning were gone, replaced by a low murmur that was more a sensation in the air than a distinct noise. The silence of the downs was so complete that the shepherd could hear the sound of a single bee passing somewhere behind him, a low drone that came and came again as the insect moved from flower to flower among the patches of wild thyme. The shadow of the cloud on the water was a dark patch that the shepherd could just make out beneath the white tower. The shadow did not move either, because the sun moved so slowly across the sky that its angle changed by amounts too small to perceive. The shadow was a darker grey on the grey-green of the channel, a shape that mirrored the shape of the cloud above, but was flattened and stretched by the angle of the light. The shepherd watched the shadow and the cloud and the haze bank and the still surface of the sea, and his mind drifted into a state that was not quite waking and not quite sleeping, but was something between the two, a quiet place where time passed without being measured, and thoughts arose without being pursued. In this state of quiet suspension the shepherd understood something about waiting that he had never put into words. He understood that waiting was not about the thing that was waited for, but about the quality of the pause itself. The cloud was not waiting for the wind to carry it away any more than the shepherd was waiting for the evening to arrive or the winter to come. The cloud was simply being a cloud in the place where it had formed, existing in the stillness, because the stillness was what the day had brought. The shepherd was simply being a shepherd on the hillside, existing in the pause because the pause was what his life had always been. The grass grew and the sheep ate the grass and the wool grew on the sheep, and the seasons turned and the shepherd watched it all from his place on the downs, and none of it was waiting for anything because all of it was already complete in each moment. The cloud across the water was not visible to the men who waited in the ships that lay beneath it. The shepherd did not know about the ships or the men or the waiting that filled their days and nights with a tension that was the opposite of his own patient stillness. The fleet had been assembled over many weeks, and now it sat in the estuary with its sails furled and its oars shipped, and its hulls riding at anchor in the sheltered water. The men on those ships watched the same cloud from below, seeing only its grey underside that blocked the sun and cast a shadow over the wooden decks. They waited for a wind that would carry them across the channel to the shore that they could not see, but which they knew lay just beyond the haze. Their waiting was a sharp and urgent thing, filled with the knowledge of what was to come and the fear that the wind might never arrive, and the hope that it would arrive soon, and the boredom of long days spent in the cramped quarters of the ships with nothing to do but wait. The shepherd knew none of this and would never know it. His waiting was a soft and formless thing that had no object and no urgency and no end. He sat on the crest of the ridge and watched the cloud that looked like a castle keep, and felt the stillness of the air on his face, and the weight of his cloak on his shoulders, and the slow rhythm of his breathing in his chest. The sun continued its imperceptible slide toward the western horizon, and the shadow of the cloud on the water shifted by a fraction of a degree that no eye could detect. The sheep grazed and rested and grazed again, and the bee moved among the wild thyme, and the tide whispered against the shingle beach. The cloud began to change in the late afternoon. The process was so gradual that the shepherd could not say when it started, only that at some point he looked at the white tower and saw that it was no longer a tower. The battlements had melted away into a soft, rounded dome, and the window had closed completely so that the cloud was now a solid mass of white, with no features to distinguish it from any other cumulus. The edges of the cloud had begun to fray slightly, as the still air slowly eroded the sharp boundaries that had held it in the shape of a keep. Tiny wisps of white vapor separated from the main body and faded into the blue of the sky, so small and so slow that they were gone before the shepherd could focus on them. He watched the cloud dissolve for the remainder of the afternoon. The process was like watching a lump of snow melt in the sun, except that there was no water, and no dripping and no sound at all. The cloud simply became less distinct and less solid and less present, its white fading to a pale grey and its shape spreading outward until it was no longer a single thing, but a diffuse patch of lighter sky that merged with the haze bank below. By the time the sun touched the western horizon, the cloud was gone completely, and there was only the grey bank of haze and the flat grey-green of the sea and the pale blue of the sky above. The shepherd rose from the grass and stretched his stiff limbs and picked up his crook. The stillness of the day had begun to break with the cooling of the evening, and a faint breath of air moved across his face from the southwest. The grass stirred slightly, and the sheep lifted their heads, and the world began to return to its normal state of gentle motion. He walked back down the slope toward the hut with his shadow stretching long and blue across the turf, and he did not think about the cloud or the waiting or the ships that lay hidden beyond the haze. He thought about the evening bread and the leather bottle and the warmth of the flint stone where he would sit to watch the stars appear. The pause was over, and the world was moving again, and everything was exactly as it had been, before the wind dropped, and the cloud formed, and the long, still day began. The night came on slowly, and the shepherd sat on the flint stone and watched the sky darken and the stars emerge. The wind from the southwest was gentle and steady, and it carried the familiar smell of the sea and the damp chalk and the distant salt. The sheep settled in their hollow, and the tide whispered against the shingle, and the shepherd wrapped his cloak around himself and let his breathing slow to match the rhythm of the night. The cloud that had looked like a castle keep was gone, and the fleet that lay beneath it was still waiting, and the wind that would carry it across the water was still absent. None of this mattered to the shepherd on his hillside, because his waiting was over, and he was simply present in the quiet of the evening, a man and his flock, and the slow turning of the sky above the downs. The morning of the 27th day of September arrived with a quality of cold that the shepherd had not felt since the previous spring, a dry and penetrating chill that reached through the wool of his cloak and the linen of his tunic and settled into the joints of his fingers and the bones of his ankles. He woke in the darkness of the hut, with the awareness of this cold pressing against his face, where the blanket had slipped down during the night, the skin of his cheeks and nose and forehead exposed to the air that had been cooling for hours while he slept. The cold was not the damp cold of the fog or the bitter cold of midwinter, but something else entirely, a clean, sharp cold that spoke of clear skies and a high pressure and the turning of the season toward the darker months. He lay still on his bed of bracken and felt the cold on his face and listened to the quality of the silence outside the flint walls. The silence on this morning was different from the heavy, muffled silence of the sea fret, and different from the profound stillness of the windless day. It was a thin and brittle silence that seemed to crackle at the edges, a quiet through which small sounds travelled great distances, with a clarity that was almost painful. The shepherd heard the distant cry of a gull circling over the cliffs far below, a sound that on a normal morning was a faint and blurry thing, but which now reached his ears as a series of sharp individual notes that cut through the cold air like the edge of a flint blade. He heard the rustle of a mouse in the thatch above his head, a tiny scratching that was usually lost in the background noise of the wind, but which now stood out against the perfect quiet of the pre-dawn world. He heard his own breathing and the slow beat of his heart and the creak of his joints as he shifted his weight on the bracken. He rose from the bed with the slow care that the cold demanded, his muscles stiff and his skin prickling where the chill air found the gaps in his clothing. The cloak was heavy on the peg, and he lifted it with both hands and swung it around his shoulders with a practiced motion that settled the weight across his back and his arms. The wool was cold against his neck, where the bronze pin would later rest, and he tucked the edges of the fabric under his chin and held them there with his left hand, while his right hand reached for the crook that leaned against the flint wall. The wood of the crook was cold too, the smooth surface chilled by the night air until it felt like a piece of ice in his palm, and he shifted his grip several times as he walked toward the doorway, allowing the warmth of his hand to seep into the blackthorn. The leather flap that covered the doorway was stiff with the cold and made a faint cracking sound when he pushed it aside. He ducked through the low opening and straightened up outside the hut into a world that was still dark but which held the first faint suggestion of the light that would come. The sky above the eastern ridge was no longer the deep black of full night, but had begun to soften into a grey so dark it was almost blue, a colour that the shepherd recognized as the herald of the dawn, even though the sun itself was still far below the horizon. The stars were still visible in the western half of the sky, where the darkness had not yet begun to fade, and the shepherd looked up at them out of habit, and saw that the wagon had turned almost completely around the fixed star during the night, and now hung low in the northwest with its shaft pointing downward toward the unseen sea. The grass under his sandals was stiff and white, with a heavy frost that had formed in the cold hours after midnight. The frost was not the thick white blanket of deep winter, but a lighter coating that dusted each blade and each tussock and each small stone, with a layer of tiny ice crystals that caught the faint starlight and glittered like a field of crushed glass. The shepherd's sandals crunched softly as he walked, the sound of the frozen grass breaking under his weight, carrying across the still air with a clarity that made each footstep seem louder than it actually was. He walked toward the crest of the ridge with his breath forming small clouds of vapor that hung in the air for a moment before dissipating into the cold. The path to the crest was familiar, and his feet found it without the aid of his eyes. The ground rose gently beneath him, and the frost grew thinner as he climbed, because the cold air settled in the hollows and the lower slopes while the ridge tops remained slightly warmer. By the time he reached the highest point of the crest, the frost had given way to grass that was merely wet with dew rather than frozen, and his sandals made a soft squelching sound rather than a crunch. He stopped at the place where he always stopped, a small flat area of turf that had been worn smooth by his own standing and by the standing of shepherds before him, and he planted his crook in the ground beside him and faced toward the sea. The sea was not yet visible as anything more than a vast darkness that filled the lower half of the world. The line where the water met the sky was invisible in the pre-dawn gloom, and the shepherd could not tell where the channel ended and the heavens began. He stood and waited in the cold and watched the eastern horizon, where the soft grey was slowly spreading upward and outward, pushing back the stars one by one as the hidden sun approached the rim of the world. The cold pressed against his face and his hands, and the exposed skin of his ankles between the tops of his sandals and the hem of his tunic. But he did not shiver, because his body had learned long ago to accept the cold without fighting it. The light grew slowly in the way that light always grew on the downs, by such small increments that the shepherd could not identify the moment when the world changed from dark to dim. The grey above the eastern ridge deepened and warmed, losing its blue undertone and taking on a faint suggestion of rose that was not yet colour, but was no longer the absence of colour. The stars in the west faded one by one until only the brightest remained, and then those too were gone and the sky was a uniform dome of pale grey that arched over the land and the sea. The water below the cliffs began to separate itself from the sky as a slightly darker grey, a flat expanse that stretched away toward the horizon where the haze bank had lived for so many days. The haze bank was gone. The shepherd noticed this absence in the same way he noticed the presence of his ewes during the morning, counting, a simple acknowledgement that something that had been there was there no longer. The line where the water met the sky was sharp and clear and hard, a boundary drawn with a fine pen of grey on grey that divided the world into two distinct halves. There was no soft blur of moisture, no bank of cloud, no suggestion of anything lying beyond the visible water. The channel stretched away to the south and the east and the west as a single unbroken surface of grey-green that reflected the pale sky and showed no feature and no variation and no sign of anything but water and light. The shepherd looked at the empty horizon with the same calm attention he had given to the haze bank on all the mornings before. He was not looking for anything, because there was nothing to look for. The sea was the sea, and the sky was the sky, and the boundary between them was clear and sharp and held no mystery. He stood on the crest of the ridge, with his crook in his hand and his cloak heavy on his shoulders and his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and he watched the light grow and the colours emerge from the grey as the sun approached the edge of the world. The first true colour of the morning appeared as a thin, high streak of cirrus cloud that hung far above the eastern horizon. The cloud was so high and so thin that it had been invisible in the grey pre-dawn light. But now, as the sun climbed closer to the rim of the earth, the cloud caught the first pink light of a day that had not yet begun. The pink was pale and delicate, and lasted only for a few moments before fading into a soft gold and then into white as the sun continued its slow ascent. The shepherd watched the cloud change colour, and then watched it fade back into the general brightness of the morning sky, and his face was still, and his eyes were calm, and his mind was empty of any thought beyond the simple observation of the light. The sun cleared the horizon as a sliver of brilliant gold that was too bright to look at directly. The shepherd shifted his gaze to the water below, where the light of the new sun was spreading across the surface in a path of shimmering gold that stretched from the base of the cliffs to the distant line of the horizon. The path was broad and bright, and it moved with the gentle motion of the tide, the light breaking into thousands of small points that danced and shifted and reformed in patterns that were never the same from one moment to the next. The shepherd watched the path of light on the water for a long time without moving, his eyes following the shimmer, and his breathing slow and steady, and his body still in the cold morning air. The channel was empty. The shepherd did not think this thought in words, because there were no words in his mind for the concept of a sea that was full. The sea had always been empty in his experience, except for the occasional fishing boat from the villages along the coast that would appear as a small dark shape against the grey water and then disappear around the headland. He had seen such boats many times over the years, and had noted their presence and their passing without any particular interest. On this morning there were no boats and no shapes and no features at all on the surface of the water. There was only the grey-green expanse, and the path of gold light, and the sharp clear line of the horizon where the sea met the sky. He turned away from the sea after a time that could not be measured in any way that mattered. The turning was not a decision, but a completion, the end of the moment of looking and the beginning of the moment of walking. He faced the land now, and the sun was at his back, and his shadow stretched out before him across the frost-whitened grass of the slope. The shadow was long and thin, and it pointed down into the valley where the flock was beginning to stir in their sleeping hollow. The shepherd began to walk toward the sound of the first ewe bleating for her lamb, a sound that cut through the cold morning air with the same sharp clarity as the gull's cry had done in the darkness. The grass on the landward slope was long and heavy with dew that had not frozen, because this side of the hill was sheltered from the coldest air by the bulk of the ridge. The dew was not the light misting of a summer morning, but a thick wetness that soaked into the leather of his sandals and darkened the hem of his tunic as he walked. Each blade of grass was bowed under the weight of the water it carried, and the whole hillside seemed to sag slightly under the burden of the dew. The shepherd's footsteps made a soft squelching sound in the wet turf, a sound that was repeated with each step, and that blended with the sound of his breathing, and the distant bleating of the flock, and the faint whisper of the tide that still reached his ears from the sea behind him. The sound of the grass growing was not a sound that could be heard with human ears. The shepherd knew this in the same way he knew that the stars turned around the fixed point, and that the seasons followed one another in an order that never changed. The grass grew in silence and in patience, adding length to its blades and depth to its roots, in increments so small that no eye could detect them and no ear could perceive them. But the shepherd walked down the slope through the long wet grass and listened to the quiet of the morning, and in that quiet he could imagine the sound that the grass would make if it could be heard. It would be a sound like the slow drawing of a thread through cloth, or the faint creak of a rafter settling in the night, or the distant hiss of the tide on the shingle beach. It would be a sound so soft and so constant that it would become a part of the silence itself, indistinguishable from the quiet that filled the valley and the sky and the shepherd's own mind. The flock was rising from their hollow as he approached, their white bodies emerging from the dark turf like stones being uncovered by the retreating tide. The old ewe with the mismatched horns was the first to stand, her joints creaking in the cold and her breath forming small clouds around her dark face. She looked at the shepherd with her blank yellow eyes and made a low sound in her throat that was neither a greeting nor a question, but simply an acknowledgement of his presence. The other ewes rose around her and shook the dew from their fleeces with a rippling motion that passed from their shoulders to their tails. The lambs pressed against their mother's sides and made small bleating sounds that were answered by the deeper voices of the ewes. The black-faced ram stood at the edge of the hollow with his great horns catching the morning light and his broad chest facing toward the sun. The shepherd walked among them with his slow and steady pace, his hand reaching out to touch a fleece here and a flank there, his eyes moving over the familiar faces and noting the familiar marks and the familiar patterns of dark and light. The wool was damp from the dew and the lanolin was cool and tacky under his fingers. The sheep accepted his touch without moving away, their heads turning briefly toward him, and then returning to the more important business of beginning the day's grazing. The sound of the grass being torn began again as the first ewes lowered their heads and took the first mouthfuls of the wet green blades. He completed his circuit of the flock and stood for a while at the edge of the hollow, looking down into the valley that curved away to the east. The valley was his home and his domain, and the only world he had ever known or would ever need to know. The grass grew there, and the sheep grazed there, and the deep pond held its dark water there, and the wattle fence marked the boundary there. The chalk outcrops glowed pale in the morning light, and the dry stream bed cut its shallow channel through the turf, and the flat flintstone waited on the slope above for the afternoon when he would sit and watch the shadows lengthen. All of these things were as familiar to him as his own hands and as constant as the turning of the stars. He began to walk down into the valley with no particular destination and no particular purpose. The walking was simply the continuation of the morning, the next thing after the standing and the looking and the counting. His sandals pressed the wet grass flat and left dark footprints that would spring back within the hour. The sun was higher now, and the frost on the upper slopes was beginning to melt into a fine mist that rose from the turf and caught the light in small rainbows that appeared and vanished as he walked through them. The air was warming slowly, and the cold that had settled in his joints was fading into a pleasant ache that he no longer noticed. His foot struck something hard in the grass, and he stopped and looked down. A piece of flint lay on the turf where the sheep had exposed it with their grazing, a smooth nodule of pale grey stone that had been shaped by the patient work of the sea and the chalk and the passing of ages. The flint was about the size of his palm, and it was rounded on one side and flat on the other, and its surface was covered with a thin white patina that spoke of long years in the chalk soil. He bent down and picked it up with his left hand, the crook still held in his right, and he turned it over and felt the smooth, cool weight of it against his skin. The flint was a perfect thing in its way, a piece of the ancient seabed that had been lifted up and shaped by water and time until it fit comfortably in a man's hand. The shepherd had found many such flints over the years, and had used some of them to repair the walls of his hut, and had thrown others aside without thought. This one he kept. He did not know why he kept it, except that the smoothness of it pleased his fingers, and the weight of it was a small comfort in his palm. He put the flint into the pocket of his cloak, where it rested against his thigh, and made a slight bulge in the fabric that he would feel with each step. He continued his walk down into the valley with the flint in his pocket and the crook in his hand, and the sun warm on his back. The sheep spread out around him, and the sound of their grazing filled the air with its steady rhythm. The sea was behind him, and the land was before him, and the sky was above him, and the chalk was beneath him. He walked, and he did not think about the haze that had lifted, or the sharp, clear horizon that had replaced it, or the empty water that stretched away to the south. He thought about the grass and the sheep and the weight of the flint against his leg. The valley deepened as he walked, and the sides of the hills rose up on either side, until the sea was hidden and the sky was narrowed to a strip of pale blue between the green shoulders of the downs. The path he followed was one he had walked 1,000 times and would walk 1,000 times more, a pale line in the turf that led down toward the spring, at the foot of the cliffs where he would fill his leather bottle in a day or two. He did not walk all the way to the spring on this morning, but stopped after a while at a place where the valley opened out into a broad bowl of grass, and the sheep could graze on the sweet growth that the spring moisture encouraged. He stood in the center of the bowl and turned in a slow circle and looked at the hills that surrounded him on all sides. The downs rolled away in waves of green and white and grey, their contours soft and ancient and worn smooth by the weather of ages. The chalk gleamed where it broke through the turf, and the gorse bushes made dark patches on the slopes, and the distant line of the Weald was a smudge of deeper green on the northern horizon. The shepherd saw all of this and felt the quiet of the valley settle over him like a second cloak. He walked to the edge of the bowl and sat down on a tussock of grass that was dry enough to provide a seat. The flint in his pocket pressed against his thigh, and he shifted his weight so that it rested more comfortably. The sheep grazed around him, and the sun climbed higher, and the morning passed into the early part of the afternoon. He sat and watched and listened and breathed and did nothing else. The story of the shepherd on the Sussex Downs does not end, because stories of this kind do not have endings. They simply continue in the same way that the grass continues to grow, and the tide continues to rise and fall, and the stars continue to turn around the fixed point in the northern sky. The shepherd will rise tomorrow and count his flock and mend his fence, and watch the clouds form and dissolve above the channel. He will not know about the fleet that gathered across the water, or the wind that finally came on the 28th day of September, or the ships that crossed the narrow sea under the cover of darkness. He will not know about the battle that will be fought on a hillside far to the east, or the changes that will ripple outward from that day and touch every corner of the land. He will know only the downs and the sheep, and the slow patient rhythm of a life lived in the pause between one thing and another. The shepherd sat on the tussock in the bold of the valley, and felt the sun on his face and the weight of the flint in his pocket. The sound of the grass being torn by small teeth filled the air around him and blended with the distant whisper of the tide and the soft rustle of the wind in the gorse. He closed his eyes and let the sounds wash over him like water over the smooth stones of the dry stream bed. The morning of the 27th of September passed into the afternoon, and the afternoon would pass into the evening, and the evening would pass into the evening, and the evening would pass into the night. The shepherd would rise and walk and sit and sleep and rise again. The grass would grow and the sheep would eat the grass and the wool would grow on the sheep. The cycle would continue without end and without beginning, a slow and patient turning that asked nothing and promised nothing and simply was. He opened his eyes and looked out over the valley and saw the flock spread across the green bowl like scattered clouds on a pale sky. The black-faced ram stood on a small rise and faced toward the sea that he could not see. The old ewe with the mismatched horns grazed near the edge of the spring-fed grass. The smallest lamb with the unmarked white face wandered a few steps from its mother and then returned to her side. The shepherd watched them all and felt the familiar quiet settle into his chest and his bones and his breath. He rose from the tussock after a long while and began the slow walk back up the valley toward the hut. The flint was a small weight against his leg, and the crook was a familiar presence in his hand, and the cloak was a warm weight on his shoulders. His footsteps made a soft sound in the grass, and his shadow walked beside him, and the sun moved across the sky in its patient arc. He walked up out of the valley and into the narrative of his own quiet life, and the story closed behind him like water closing over a stone.